Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The first time I noticed our catch disappearing, I dismissed it as bad counting. Second time, I blamed raccoons. By the third time, I knew something wasn't right, but I sure as hell didn't expect what we found. My name's Phil. Back in the mid-80s, times were tough in Southwest Washington. The lumber mills were shutting down, and guys like me and my Vietnam buddy Dick were struggling to feed our families. We'd both served in the jungle together, seen things most folks wouldn't believe. After coming home, we'd settled within 30 miles of each other, me in Morton, him over in Mossy Rock. When the economy tanked, we started night poaching salmon at the Nassau River bridge. Illegal? Yeah. Necessary? Absolutely. My kids weren't going hungry because some bureaucrat in Olympia decided when I could and couldn't fish. We'd go out after midnight, when even the most dedicated game wardens were home in bed. The bridge had this single floodlight that cast long shadows across the water. Below it was a deep pool where the kings would gather before continuing upriver to spawn. Dick had rigged up some treble hooks, nasty three-pronged affairs that could snag a fish, even if it didn't bite. We'd cast out, drag through the pool, and usually hook something on every third or fourth pass. It was late July 2008, hot as hell during the day but cooling nicely at night. We'd been at it for about 2 weeks, stockpiling salmon in our freezers. We kept a careful count. 6 fish per night was our limit, not because of regulations, but because that's all we could reasonably carry and clean. We'd clean them right there under the bridge, toss the guts in a pile for the critters, and stash the fish behind this big Douglas fir about 20 yards from the water. Then we'd go back for more. That's when I noticed the pattern. Every night, without fail, when we'd return to the tree, 2 fish would be gone. Not 1, not 3. Always exactly 2. "Dick," I said one night as we approached our hiding spot, "you taking fish home between runs?" He looked at me like I was crazy. Why the hell would I do that? Sure enough, 2 more salmon were missing. No drag marks, no blood trail. Just gone. "Maybe bears," Dick suggested, scanning the ground for tracks. I shook my head. A bear would take more than 2, and we'd see prints. The ground around our cache was undisturbed except for our own boot prints. Nothing made sense. "Let's stake it out tomorrow," I said. "Catch whatever's doing this." Dick nodded, his face grim in the moonlight. The whole thing had him spooked, though he wouldn't admit it. The next night, we arrived earlier than usual, around midnight. Instead of starting to fish right away, we hunkered down in the blackberry bushes that lined the riverbank, about 20 yards from the bridge. Our plan was to watch for a while, see if we could catch our thief, then proceed with fishing once the coast was clear. The night was dead quiet, except for the gentle gurgle of the river and the occasional hoot of an owl. Moths circled the bridge floodlight, casting tiny moving shadows. The air smelled of river water, fish, and the sweet decay of summer vegetation. We'd been waiting maybe 30 minutes when we heard it, the sound of gravel crunching under heavy weight. "Warden," Dick whispered, pressing lower into the bushes. I nodded, though something felt off. The footsteps were too heavy, too widely spaced. A game warden would have a flashlight too, but there was no beam sweeping the area. The crunching came closer, moving down the bank toward the bridge. Then I saw it, and every hair on my body stood straight up. Silhouetted against the bridge floodlight was the largest being I've ever seen. It stood in the shallow edge of the river, water reaching only to its massive calf. And when I say massive, I mean this thing's lower leg was the diameter of a 5-gallon bucket. I'm not exaggerating. The creature had to be 7, maybe 8 feet tall. Jesus Christ, Dick breathed beside me, so quietly I barely heard him. The thing bent forward at the waist, reaching down to the pile of fish guts we'd left from previous nights. Its right hand, if you could call it that, scooped into the mess. Its left hand worked like a spatula, not using its thumb, just sweeping guts into its mouth. The slurping sounds carried clearly across the water. It wasn't chewing, just swallowing everything whole with wet, greedy noises that turned my stomach. The thing ate like it was starving, like it had never tasted anything so good as rotting salmon entrails. I could make out more details now that my eyes had adjusted. The creature had enormous shoulders, impossibly broad, with no visible neck. Its head seemed to sit directly on those shoulders, large and covered in dark hair, about 3 or 4 inches long. In the dim light, the hair looked black or dark brown. My body was frozen, but my mind raced. What the hell were we looking at? Not a bear. Bears don't stand like that. Not a man. No human is built that way. I'd been in the wilderness my whole life and never seen anything remotely like this. That's when I screwed up. Shifting my weight, I cracked a small branch under my boot. The sound wasn't loud, but in that quiet night, it might as well have been a gunshot. The creature whirled around instantly, dropping into a crouch. The movement was so fast, so fluid, it didn't seem possible for something that size. Its head swiveled, scanning the darkness where we hid. I couldn't see its face clearly, thank God, but I felt it searching. My lungs refused to work. Beside me, Dick had gone completely rigid. For about 10 seconds, the longest 10 seconds of my life, the thing stared in our direction. I was certain it would charge us any moment. We had nothing but our fishing gear and a small filleting knife between us. Then, without warning, it sprinted away. When I say sprinted, I don't mean it lumbered off like you'd expect something that size to move. This thing moved with incredible speed, crashing through the underbrush on the far side of the river. We could hear branches breaking, vegetation being trampled. The sound faded quickly as it disappeared into the forest. Neither of us moved for at least 5 minutes. I couldn't even look at Dick. My hands were shaking so bad I had to press them against the ground. "What the fuck was that?" Dick finally whispered. I shook my head. "I don't know." "Bigfoot." He almost laughed as he said it, but there was no humor in his voice. "I don't know," I repeated, because what else could I say? Nothing in my experience prepared me for what we'd just seen. Eventually we gathered enough courage to stand up. My legs felt weak, rubbery. We approached the spot where the creature had been feeding. The pile of fish guts was gone, consumed entirely. The shallow water revealed only divots in the gravel where it had stood, deep impressions that confirmed the impossible weight of the thing. We didn't fish that night. Instead, we drove to the all-night diner in Centralia and drank coffee until sunrise, speaking little. What was there to say? We'd both seen it. We both knew it was real. The next day, I went back alone in daylight. I told myself I was checking for evidence, but honestly, I needed to confirm I hadn't dreamed the whole thing. The divots in the gravel remained, though less distinct after the water had flowed over them. There was a clear path of broken vegetation where the creature had fled. That night, against all good sense, I returned to fish. Dick refused to come, said he was done with night poaching. Can't say I blamed him. I didn't see the creature again, but I left fish guts under the bridge. By morning, they were gone. No bear tracks, no raccoon prints, nothing to explain their disappearance except the memory of what we'd witnessed. This continued for nearly 2 weeks. I'd fish, leave guts, and by morning they'd vanish without a trace. I never again caught the thing in the act, though sometimes I felt watched from the tree line across the river. Dick and I lost touch immediately after the incident. He stopped returning my calls, moved away within a month. I heard through mutual friends he'd taken a job in Idaho. Can't say I was surprised. The encounter had shaken him deeply, shaken us both. Some things change how you see the world, and once that happens, you can't go back. I kept fishing other spots, legal ones in daylight, but I never returned to that bridge after summer's end. As the years passed, I told myself maybe we'd seen some deformed bear or a man in a costume, though neither explanation made sense. In January 2008, after keeping quiet for over 20 years, I finally reported what we'd seen to a group that investigates such things. The interviewer asked detailed questions, showed me pictures of known animals. Nothing matched. He didn't laugh or dismiss my story, which surprised me. Turns out there had been other reports from that area over the years. I'm 63 now. I've had a good life, raised my kids, seen my share of the world. But I've never forgotten that night under the bridge, never stopped wondering what exactly we encountered. Sometimes, when I'm fishing alone at dusk and the light gets just right, I find myself scanning the tree line. I listen for heavy footsteps, for the sound of branches breaking under impossible weight. And when night falls completely, I pack up and head home. I don't fish after dark anymore. I know what's out there. Story 2. I still remember the smell that day. Pine sap, gunpowder, and the metallic tang of blood in the air. September 15th, 2010. The dates burned into my memory like a brand. My name's David Jones. I'm from Macedon-Hydegway, British Columbia. I was 22 then, thought I knew these woods like the back of my hand. Grew up hunting, tracking, learning the ways of my Hyde ancestors. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened that day. The morning started normal enough. Me, my Uncle Tom, and my cousins Lester and Harlan packed into Tom's old Ford pickup before dawn. Standard hunting trip. We'd been tracking deer for days, had a good idea where a nice buck was moving through a clearing about 5 miles west of Cadla-Hyde-Gway. The truck bumped along the logging roads, suspension groaning against the ruts and holes. "Should be a good day," Tom said, his calloused hands gripping the steering wheel. "Barometer's steady. They'll be moving." I nodded, rifle resting between my knees, the weight of it familiar and comforting. We didn't talk much on these trips. Didn't need to. 4 men who'd hunted together enough times to have routines, signals, expectations. The sun was just starting to burn through the morning fog when Tom slowed the truck. "There," he whispered, pointing through the windshield. About 75 yards ahead, I caught movement. The flick of an ear, the twitch of a tail. A decent-sized buck partially obscured by brush, but I could make out the rack clearly enough. 4 points, maybe 5. "I got this one," I said, already opening my door. The hinge squeaked, but I eased it open slowly. The buck hadn't noticed us yet. I stepped onto the damp forest floor, raised my .30-06 to my shoulder, and drew a breath. Sighted down the barrel. Exhaled halfway and held it. Squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the morning stillness. The buck jumped, staggered, and dropped. Clean shot, right through the vitals. I lowered my rifle and glanced back at the truck, where the others were nodding approvingly. "Good shot, David," Tom called through his open window. "Let's give it a minute to be sure." Standard procedure. You don't rush up on a wounded animal. So I stood there, rifle still in hand, watching for any movement from the downed deer. Nothing. It was a clean kill. "Looks like he's down for good," I said, starting to walk toward the brush where the deer had fallen. That's when it happened. A crash from the woods to our left. Not like a deer moving. This was heavy, powerful. The sound of underbrush being smashed aside by something big. Really big. I froze mid-step, my hand tightening on my rifle. Tom and the others were suddenly alert in the truck, all eyes turned toward the sound, and then it stepped onto the logging road. I've tried to explain this to people who weren't there. Words don't do it justice. It was massive, 7.5 feet tall if it was an inch, covered in dark, matted hair, not fur like a bear, hair, long and stringy in places, especially on its head and shoulders, hanging down a good 6 inches. The color was dark brown, almost black where it was thickest. It moved in a way that wasn't quite human, but wasn't quite animal either. Upright on two legs, but with a strange rolling gait. The shoulders, Jesus, the shoulders. They were impossibly broad, tapering down to a narrower waist. The proportions were all wrong for a human, too big, too powerful. The thing crossed the logging road in 3 strides. 3. A distance that would have taken me 10 or 12 steps. It moved with purpose, heading directly toward where my deer had fallen. I caught a glimpse of its face. The skin underneath the hair was dark, almost black, in stark contrast to the matted hair. It never looked at us, never acknowledged our presence, just crashed into the brush on the other side of the road, exactly where my deer had dropped. I stood rooted to the spot, unable to move, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Behind me, I heard Lester whisper, "Holy shit! David, get back in the truck." Tom's voice was steady but urgent. "Now." I didn't argue. I backed up slowly, eyes fixed on where the creature had disappeared, then scrambled back into the passenger seat, slamming the door harder than I intended. The sound echoed through the trees. "What the fuck was that?" Harlan's voice cracked from the back seat. None of us answered immediately. We sat in silence, the engine idling, all eyes fixed on the spot where the creature had vanished. "Sasquatch," Tom finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That was a goddamn Sasquatch." "Bullshit," Lester said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "There's no such thing." "You saw it, same as we did," I said. My hands were shaking. I set my rifle down between my feet to hide the tremor. "That wasn't a bear." "Sure as hell wasn't a man in a suit either," Tom added. We sat there for what seemed like forever, debating whether to leave or try to recover my deer. None of us wanted to get out of the truck. The forest suddenly seemed different, alien, threatening. "Look, I'm not saying we should go after whatever that was," Tom finally said. "But that's a good deer you shot, David. We can't just leave it." "You want me to go get it?" I asked, my mouth dry. "I think it's probably safe now," Tom said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "That thing, whatever it was, is probably long gone." I wasn't so sure, but I also wasn't going to look like a coward in front of my family. I checked my rifle, made sure it was loaded, and slowly opened the door again. "You want me to come with you?" Harlan offered, but I could hear the relief in his voice when I shook my head. "I'll be quick," I promised. "Keep the engine running." I stepped out, my boots crunching on the gravel of the logging road. The forest had gone quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush. Nothing. I moved carefully across the road, rifle at the ready, every sense heightened. The spot where the deer had fallen was about 75 yards from the road, not far. I could do this. The brush was thick, scratching at my arms and face as I pushed through. I reached the spot where the deer should have been. There was blood on the ground, on the leaves. A good amount of it. But no deer. I stood there, confused, scanning the area. Had I misjudged where it fell? No, this was definitely the spot. I could see where the body had lain, flattening the vegetation. But the carcass was gone. I knelt down, examining the blood-soaked ground. There were no drag marks, no sign of the deer being pulled away. It was as if it had simply vanished. I looked for tracks, bear, cougar, anything that might have taken the kill. Nothing. Just the indentation where the deer had fallen, and blood. A chill ran up my spine. I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that the creature we'd seen had taken my deer, and it had done it without leaving a single track. I stood quickly, suddenly very aware of how alone I was. The silence of the forest pressed in around me. I had the distinct feeling of being watched. "David!" Tom's voice called from the truck. "You okay?" "Yeah," I called back, already turning to head back to the road. "Coming back!" I moved faster this time, less concerned with stealth and more with getting back to the safety of the truck. The brush seemed to clutch at me, holding me back. I broke through to the logging road with a sense of relief that was almost dizzying. "It's gone," I said as I climbed back into the truck, breathing hard. "The deer's gone." Gone how? Lester leaned forward from the back seat. Just gone, I said. There's blood where it fell, but no deer. No tracks, no drag marks, nothing. The four of us exchanged looks. We all knew what that meant, but none of us wanted to say it. Let's get out of here, Tom said finally, putting the truck in gear. We'll find another spot. But we didn't. We drove straight back to town, mostly in silence. Each of us lost in our own thoughts about what we'd seen. Word spread fast in Masid. By nightfall, the whole community was buzzing with the story. Some people believed us right away, especially the elders. The Hyde people have stories about the Sasquatch going back generations. Others were skeptical, thought we were exaggerating or had seen a bear. But I know what I saw. We all do. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. That massive figure crossing the road in 3 strides, the matted hair, the impossible breadth of its shoulders. I kept thinking about how it had moved with such purpose toward my deer, how it had taken the carcass without leaving a single track. The next morning, Tom came by my place. He looked as tired as I felt. "You want to go back out?" he asked, standing on my porch. I hesitated. The honest answer was no. The thought of going back into those woods made my stomach knot up. But there was something else too. A need to understand, to make sense of what we'd seen. "Yeah," I said finally. "Let's go." This time, it was just Tom and me. Lester and Harlan had suddenly found pressing business elsewhere. We drove back to the same spot, the truck bouncing over the same ruts. Everything looked different in the clear light of day, less threatening, but I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. We parked at the same spot and got out, both of us carrying our rifles. The air was still, the forest quiet, but not unnaturally so. Birds called from the trees, a squirrel chattered its displeasure at our presence. "Show me where the deer was," Tom said. I led him across the road and into the brush. The blood had dried to a rusty brown, still visible on the leaves and ground. Tom knelt, examining the area just as I had the day before. "No tracks," he confirmed, looking up at me. "Not even deer tracks, just the blood." "I told you," I said, scanning the trees around us. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "It's like it just vanished." Tom stood up, brushing off his hands. "Let's check around, see if we can find any sign of anything." We spent an hour combing the area in widening circles from where the deer had fallen. Nothing. No tracks, no hair, no broken branches that couldn't be explained by normal forest activity. It was as if the creature had never existed, except we both saw it. We both knew it was real. Since that day, I've gone back to those woods many times. Hunting, fishing, just hiking. I've never seen the creature again, but I feel its presence. There are moments when the forest goes quiet, when the hair on the back of my neck stands up, when I know I'm not alone. I've talked to other Hyde people who've had similar experiences. Sightings, strange sounds in the night, game disappearing from where it fell. We don't talk about it much with outsiders. They tend to laugh, to dismiss it as superstition or mistake. But we know. The elders say the Sasquatch has always been there, a part of the forest as much as the trees and rocks. They say it's not something to fear necessarily, but to respect, to understand that there are things in this world beyond our comprehension. I don't know about all that. What I do know is what I saw that September morning. A creature that shouldn't exist but does. A being that can move through the forest without leaving a trace, that can take a full-grown deer and vanish with it. That night, after we'd come back from our second trip to the site, Tom and I sat on my porch, nursing beers and watching the sunset. Neither of us had said much on the drive back. "You know," Tom finally said, "my grandfather used to tell stories about the Sasquatch, said they were guardians of the forest, that they only showed themselves to certain people for a reason." "What reason would that be?" I asked. Tom shrugged. "He never said. Or if he did, I was too young to understand. I thought about that massive figure crossing the road, the purposeful way it moved, how it never even glanced our way. "Do you think we should tell more people?" I asked. "Try to get proof next time?" Tom was quiet for a long moment. "What would be the point?" he finally said. "Those who already believe don't need proof. Those who don't believe won't be convinced by anything we could say or show them." He took a long drink of his beer. "Besides, maybe some things should remain mysteries." I nodded, understanding what he meant. There was something about that encounter that felt private, almost sacred. The creature hadn't threatened us, hadn't even acknowledged us. It had simply gone about its business, taking the deer I'd killed. Maybe that was reason enough. The years have passed, but that day remains crystal clear in my memory. Sometimes when I'm in the woods alone, I catch myself looking for that dark, massive figure among the trees. I never see it, but sometimes, just sometimes, I feel it watching me, and that's enough. Story 3. The sound woke me. A low, rhythmic breathing that wasn't mine. At first I thought it was just the wind pushing through the cracks of my cabin walls, but there was something different about it, something alive. My eyes shot open in the darkness. The weight came next, heavy, pressing down across my chest and legs. A damp, musky smell filled my nostrils, sharp and animal-like, but not quite like anything I'd caught or skinned before. My name's Alan Whiteclaw. Some folks in Nakina call me Old Man A these days, but back then I was just a young trapper making my living off the Ontario wilderness. Had 5 cabins scattered across my territory, about 30 miles from town. Good land, peaceful, until that night in '67. I lay there, heart pounding so hard I was sure whatever was in my cabin could hear it. The moonlight filtered through my single window, casting long shadows across the dirt floor, and that's when I felt it, the unmistakable texture of hair brushing against my arm. Coarse, thick hair that didn't belong to any blanket I owned. I turned my head slowly, barely breathing. That's when I saw it. An arm. Not a human arm. This thing was massive, covered in dark, matted hair and draped across my chest like I was some kind of teddy bear. The fingers at the end of it were thick, with dark nails that looked more like claws. My blood went cold. Every instinct told me to scream, to fight, to run, but somehow I knew that would be the last thing I ever did. So I lay there, barely breathing, and carefully, inch by inch, began to slide out from under that massive limb. It felt like it took hours. Every time the creature's breathing changed rhythm, I froze, certain it was about to wake. The arm was heavy, heavier than a full-grown deer carcass, and moving it without disturbing its owner took every ounce of control I had. The cabin floor was cold against my bare feet as I finally slipped free. I stood there, shaking, watching the creature on my bed. The thing took up the entire frame, hanging off both ends, had to be over 7 feet long. Its body rose and fell with deep, slow breaths. In the dim light I could make out the broad shape of its back, the massive shoulders, and, I'll never forget this detail, the unmistakable curve of breasts on its chest. It was female. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just some animal seeking shelter. This was something else entirely. Something that had chosen my cabin, chosen me. My rifle leaned against the wall by the door, maybe 10 feet away. I'd have to cross open space to reach it, right in the creature's line of sight if it woke. My hunting knife was on the table beside the bed, too close to the sleeping giant to risk. So I began to inch toward the door, testing each floorboard before putting my weight on it, praying none would creak. 5 feet, 8 feet, almost there. That's when her breathing changed. A hitch, then a low rumble that wasn't quite a snore. I froze, watching as she shifted her massive body, the bed frame groaning under her weight. She rolled slightly, and in the moonlight I caught a clear view of her face. It was both human and not. A broad forehead sloped back from heavy brow ridges. Her nose was flat and wide, her jaw powerful, and the hair, that dark matted hair, covered everything except the area around her eyes, nose, and mouth. Those eyes remained closed, but I knew with absolute certainty that if they opened, they'd be looking directly at me. My hand closed around the stock of my rifle. I lifted it silently from its place, not daring to chamber a round. The door latch, usually so simple to operate, now seemed impossibly complicated as I fumbled with it, fingers trembling. The latch gave with a soft click that sounded like thunder in the quiet cabin. I pulled the door open just enough to slip through and stepped out into the cold night air. That's when I heard it, movement from inside the cabin. The bed frame creaked loudly, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps on the wooden floor. I ran, didn't grab my pack, my extra ammunition, or even my damn boots. Just ran into the pitch-black forest in my underwear and socks, rifle clutched to my chest. The sharp pain of pine needles and stones cutting into my feet barely registered. The cold bit into my skin, but fear pushed me forward. Behind me came sounds that still haunt my dreams, heavy footfalls crashing through the underbrush, branches snapping like twigs, and a high, whooping call that echoed through the trees. Not human, not animal, something else entirely. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, collapsed by a creek bed as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. Listened for pursuit, but heard only the normal sounds of the forest waking up. No heavy footsteps, no whooping calls. Still, I didn't rest. Filled my hands with creek water, splashed my face, and kept moving. Had to get back to town. Had to get back to people. It took me 2 days to reach Nakina, 2 days of jumping at every sound, of chambering around whenever a twig snapped, 2 days of hunger and cold and fear, unlike anything I'd ever known. My brother John found me stumbling down the main road into town, delirious with exhaustion, feet bloody and swollen, still clutching my rifle with white knuckles. He took me to his place, got me cleaned up, fed me, and listened to my story. "You sure it wasn't just a dream, Alan?" he asked when I'd finished. "Or maybe a bear that got into the cabin?" I just looked at him. Bears don't have arms like people. Bears don't have breasts like women. And bears sure as hell don't chase you through the woods on 2 legs. He didn't argue after that. None of the elders did when I told them later. They just nodded, faces grim. Some of them had stories of their own, things seen at the edges of firelight, tracks found around hunting camps, strange calls in the night. The old ones had a name for such creatures in our language. The white folks called them Sasquatch, Bigfoot. To us, they were simply the other people, the ones who lived deep in the woods, where humans rarely went. That was 50 years ago. Never went back to that cabin. Left everything there, traps, supplies, gear worth a month's earnings. Couldn't be paid enough to set foot in that place again. Abandoned that whole trapping line, rearranged my whole territory, lost income, lost time, but didn't care. Something else changed in me after that night. Never went into the bush without my rifle again. Not once in 50 years. Folks noticed. Before, I'd grab my fishing rod and head out to the lake without thinking twice. After, I'd have my rod in one hand and my 30-30 in the other, gathering firewood, rifle slung over my shoulder, checking a trapline, rifle in hand, not on my back. John asked me about it once. "You think that thing's still out there, looking for you?" I didn't have an answer then. Still don't. But I know what I saw, what I felt. That massive, hair-covered arm across my body, those female features, the way it tracked me through the woods that night. It knew where I lived. It had found me once. What was to stop it from finding me again? The years passed. I married, had kids, grew older. Nakina changed too. Fewer trappers, more tourists coming up to fish and hunt. The railway that cut through the wilderness brought more people, more noise. Maybe that's what drove the creatures deeper into the untouched forests. Or maybe they were still there, watching us from the trees, coming close only when they chose to. I still dream about that night. Wake up sometimes feeling that weight across my chest, that coarse hair against my skin. My wife, Marla, learned early in our marriage not to touch me while I slept. Learned after I woke up swinging, eyes wild with terror. "It's just a bad dream," she'd say, holding me until the shaking stopped. But it wasn't. Dreams fade with time. This memory never did. I'm an old man now, my trapping days long behind me. These days I sit on my porch in town, watching the young ones head out into the same forests I once knew like the back of my hand. Sometimes I warn them, "Don't sleep alone out there," I tell them. "Keep your rifle close." Most just nod politely, thinking I'm just a scared old man. Some ask why, and I tell them my story. Few believe it. That's fine. I didn't ask to be believed. Last spring, a group of researchers from Thunder Bay came through Nakina. One of them, Les Baxter, had family in our community. He'd heard the stories, he said, wanted to know more, had a fancy title, cryptozoologist, and expensive recording equipment. Said he was documenting Sasquatch encounters across Ontario. I told him what I've told you. Every detail, just as it happened. He recorded it all, asked questions, took notes, seemed to believe me, which was a change from most outsiders. "Have you ever seen it again?" he asked when I finished. "No," I said, "but I've heard things, felt things. Times when the birds go quiet and the air gets heavy. Times when something watches from the trees. Would you recognize her? The female that was in your cabin?" The question caught me off guard. Would I recognize her? After 50 years? "Yes," I said finally. "I'd know her." "How?" he pressed. "Because she'd remember me too." Les left Nakina with his recordings and his notes, published some paper that made its way back to us. My story, alongside others from across Canada and the northern states. Scientific language trying to make sense of things that science has no business explaining. There's been more reports lately. Hikers finding strange footprints, campers hearing whooping calls in the night. A tourist couple abandoned their tent and gear last summer, came running into town talking about something massive moving outside their campsite. The younger folks in the community are getting curious now. Some talk about organizing expeditions, setting up cameras, looking for the creatures on purpose. Fools, all of them. Whatever walked into my cabin that night 50 years ago didn't want to be found. It found me because it chose to. And what it wanted? Well, I try not to think about what it wanted. Last week, my grandson Kyle came back from a hunting trip up north, near where my old cabin used to stand. Said he found something strange, the ruins of an old trapper's cabin, long collapsed, with trees growing up through the rotted floor. My cabin had to be. "Found this inside, Grandpa," he said, holding out his hand. "Thought it might be yours." It was my old hunting knife, the one I'd left on the table beside my bed that night. Rusted now, handle rotted away, but still recognizable. "There was something else," Kyle said, voice lower. "Tracks, big ones, fresh. Like something's been visiting that spot, checking on it." I took the knife from him, felt its familiar weight despite the decay. "Don't go back there," I told him. "Promise me." He promised. But I saw the look in his eyes. The same curiosity that drives Les Baxter and his researchers. The need to know, to understand. They won't understand until it's too late. Until they wake up with something heavy across their chest. Something breathing in the darkness. Something that chose them. I keep my rifle by my bed to this day. Loaded. Safety off. Marla doesn't complain anymore, just accepts it as part of who I am, who I became that night. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I catch a scent on the air. Musky, wild, animal, but not quite. And I wonder if she remembers me as clearly as I remember her. If she's still out there in the deep woods thinking about the man who slipped away, wondering if someday I'll come back. You say, sir. Story 4. My hands still shake when I tell this story, even after all these years. My name's Shannon Halbrook, and back in August of 1966, I learned that some places in this world belong to things we don't understand, things we don't have names for. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. Me and my 2 girlfriends, Betty Larson and Diane Mills, packed up our 5 kids and headed to Ward Lake on Vela Island. We needed a break from the daily grind of Ketchikan. The weather was perfect, unusually warm for Alaska that time of year, and we'd been planning this camping trip for weeks. We pulled into Single Creek Campground around 3 in the afternoon. The lake stretched out before us, smooth as glass, surrounded by thick forest. The air smelled of pine and moss. The kids, my 2 boys, Tommy and Rick, plus Betty's daughter Jenny and Diane's twins, Sarah and Mike, immediately ran wild, splashing in the shallow parts of the creek while we set up camp. "Shannon, you sure we got enough food?" Betty asked, lugging a cooler from her station wagon. 2 days' worth, I said, unless the boys eat like they do at home. "Then we're doomed," Diane laughed. We set our tents, about 15 feet from the creek culvert. Perfect spot, flat ground, good view of the water, and close enough to the restrooms that the kids wouldn't have to walk far in the night. I remember feeling so satisfied with our little setup. The blue canvas tents, our folding chairs around the fire pit, the picnic table where we'd spread out our supplies. Just 3 moms and 5 kids enjoying nature. The day passed quickly. We hiked a short trail, fished a bit without catching anything worth keeping, and roasted hot dogs over the fire as the sun started to sink. The kids were exhausted by 8:30. After washing sticky marshmallow residue off hands and faces, we tucked them into their sleeping bags. Tommy, at 10, insisted he wasn't tired, but his eyes were drooping before his head hit the pillow. "Don't wander off," I told them. "If you need to use the bathroom, come get one of us first." With the kids settled, Betty, Diane, and I sat at the picnic table with mugs of instant coffee, enjoying the rare peace. The night was cool, but not cold. A 3/4 moon cast enough light that we kept our lantern turned low, just enough to see each other's faces. The creek burbled steadily through the culvert. Occasionally, fish would jump in the lake, making small splashing sounds. "This is exactly what I needed," Diane sighed, stretching her legs. "Mike's been bouncing off the walls all summer." Betty nodded. "Tell me about it. Jenny's been—" She stopped mid-sentence, her head snapping toward the creek. "What was that?" "What?" I asked, not having heard anything unusual over the water sounds. "There," Betty pointed toward the culvert. "I think there's a bear." My heart immediately skipped. Bears weren't uncommon, but with the kids in tents, even a curious black bear could be dangerous. I squinted into the darkness. At first I saw nothing, just the silver-blue sheen of moonlight on water and the dark mass of alder trees along the bank. Then I saw it, a large shape standing upright by the creek. "Is it standing on its hind legs?" Diane whispered, her voice tight. I reached for the heavy flashlight we'd left on the table. "Let's check. Bears usually run off if they know people are around." The 3 of us stood up slowly. Betty grabbed another flashlight from her bag. We moved cautiously toward the creek, stopping about 30 feet from camp. I clicked on my flashlight and swept the beam toward where we'd seen the figure. The beam caught it, and in that moment my understanding of the world changed forever. About 40 feet away, standing in the alders beside the creek, was not a bear. It was something I had no name for. The creature stood at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. It had the general shape of a man, but was impossibly massive, shoulders easily twice as wide as my husband's, with powerful arms hanging at its sides. Every inch of it was covered with black hair, thick and matted. "What the hell is that?" Diane gasped. The beam of light moved up to its head, and I felt my mouth go dry. It had no neck, just broad shoulders that seemed to connect directly to a large, rounded head. Long, dark brown hair hung down around its face in twisted clumps like dreadlocks. When our lights hit its face, it turned away, but not before I caught a glimpse of a flat, wide face. Not a muzzle like a bear. A face. "Oh my God," Betty whispered. The thing shuffled, turning its massive body toward us. Its movements were deliberate, almost awkward, but unmistakably bipedal. It swung its long arms as it began to move in our direction. "The kids," I said, my voice barely audible. We didn't discuss what to do next. Pure instinct took over. We rushed back to camp, Betty and Diane heading straight for the tents while I grabbed the car keys. The kids were groggy and confused, whining as we pulled them from warm sleeping bags. "What's happening?" Tommy asked, rubbing his eyes. "We need to move," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the terror coursing through me. "Now." We didn't properly pack, just grabbed sleeping bags, threw whatever was closest into the back of my station wagon, and bundled the kids inside. I looked back toward the creek. The creature was still there, watching us from the edge of the trees, not approaching but not retreating either. "We can't stay here," Betty said, clutching Jenny to her chest. "The picnic shelter," Diane suggested. "The one on the other side of the lake. It has 3 walls at least." I nodded, starting the engine. We left half our gear behind. The tents, most of the food, our fishing rods. Things that seemed unimportant when faced with whatever that was. The picnic shelter sat about 2 miles around the lake, accessible by a narrow dirt road. It was just a simple wooden structure with a roof and 3 walls, meant for day-use picnics during rain. Technically, camping wasn't allowed there, but at that moment, park rules were the least of our concerns. By 11:30, we had the kids settled in the corner of the shelter, wrapped in sleeping bags on the hard wooden floor. They fell back asleep quickly, as children do, unaware of the danger that had sent us fleeing. We pushed the picnic table against the open side of the shelter, a pathetic barrier that nonetheless made us feel slightly safer. "What was that thing?" Diane asked, her voice cracking. She sat with her back against the wall, hugging her knees. "Not a bear," Betty stated firmly. "Bears don't stand like that, don't move like that." I shook my head. "I don't know, but it was looking at us. It knew we were there." We kept our voices low, not wanting to wake the kids or attract attention. The forest around us seemed darker here, the trees pressing closer to the shelter than they had at our campsite. Every rustle of branches made us flinch. Betty and Diane eventually dozed off, exhaustion overpowering fear. I tried to stay awake, my back against the wall, watching the dark opening of our shelter. The flashlight sat heavy in my lap. Sometime around midnight, my eyes grew too heavy, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. A sound woke me. Heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching the shelter. At first, in that hazy state between sleep and wakefulness, I thought I was dreaming. Then a smell hit me, a powerful, musky odor like wet earth and something else, something animal but not quite. My eyes snapped open. Diane was awake too, her hand gripping my arm so tightly it hurt. We didn't speak or move. The footsteps stopped just outside our shelter. The smell grew stronger. Then, slowly, a massive shadow appeared at the opening of the shelter. It came in. It just walked right in, ducking its head beneath the roof. In the faint moonlight filtering through the trees, I could make out its shape. The same creature from the creek, 7 feet tall at least, broad-shouldered, covered in that same black hair. It moved with a strange gait, upright but rolling slightly from side to side, powerful legs carrying its massive frame. The thing moved around the shelter, seemingly examining our makeshift camp. It huffed heavily, each breath a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to fill the small space. I sat frozen, my hand over my mouth to stifle any sound. Diane was pressed against me, trembling. Betty remained asleep, curled protectively around Jenny. The creature stopped at our supplies, which we'd piled haphazardly in the corner. It reached down with hands I couldn't clearly see in the darkness and picked up our axe. a small camping hatchet we'd brought for splitting kindling. It held the tool, turning it over as if studying it. The axe looked tiny in its massive grip. For what felt like an eternity but must have been about 4 minutes, it stood there, occasionally dragging the axe across the wooden floor with a scraping sound that set my teeth on edge. It never swung the axe, just held it, examined it. All the while making those huffing sounds, breathing heavily as if the very act of standing there required great effort. The children, by some miracle, remained asleep. I couldn't move, couldn't even think about reaching for the flashlight. Some animal instinct told me that drawing attention to ourselves would be catastrophic. After about 5 minutes, the longest 5 minutes of my life, the creature turned and walked out, taking our axe with it. The heavy footsteps receded slowly, moving away from the shelter and into the forest. Even after the sound disappeared, the musky smell lingered. "Shannon," Diane whispered, her voice barely audible. "What do we do?" "Nothing," I said. "We wait for morning." Neither of us slept again that night. We sat in silence, listening to every sound in the forest, jumping at every crack of a branch or hoot of an owl. I kept thinking about the way it had moved, not like an animal on its hind legs, but like something meant to walk upright. The way it had examined the axe with what seemed like curiosity rather than aggression. Dawn arrived with excruciating slowness. As the first grey light filtered through the trees, I heard Betty stir. "What time is it?" she mumbled, then saw our faces. "What happened?" Diane told her in hushed tones while I checked on the kids. They were still asleep, their faces peaceful. I envied their ignorance. "We need to leave," I said, "as soon as possible." We started packing up what little we had, working quickly and quietly. The kids woke up grumpy and confused. "I'm hungry," Tommy complained. "We'll eat on the way home," I promised, helping him roll up his sleeping bag. Rick pointed toward the beach, just visible through the trees. "Look, Mom. What made those?" We all turned to look. There, in the soft sand of the beach, were tracks. Wide impressions, about 15 inches long, leading away from our shelter. They weren't bear tracks. I'd seen plenty of those before. These were different, broader, with what looked like 5 distinct toe impressions at the front. "We're leaving." "Now," I said, grabbing Rick's arm and pulling him back to the shelter. We packed the cars in record time. The kids sensed our urgency and stopped complaining. As we were about to leave, a park ranger's truck pulled up alongside our vehicles. "Folks, you know camping isn't allowed in the picnic shelters," he said, already pulling out his ticket book. He was young, probably mid-20s, with the confident air of someone new to authority. "We had to move," I said. "There was something at our campsite last night." He raised an eyebrow. "Something?" "By the creek," Diane added. "It came to the shelter later. It took our axe." The ranger looked amused now. "Let me guess. A bear?" "It wasn't a bear," I insisted. "It walked upright the whole time. It had arms that swung. It was covered in black hair. It had a face, not a muzzle. A face." He chuckled. "Ma'am, black bears stand on their hind legs all the time, especially when they're curious. You probably spooked it as much as it spooked you." "There are tracks," Betty said, pointing toward the beach. The ranger glanced that way dismissively. "Lots of animals around here. Look, I understand you were scared, but camping in the shelters isn't allowed. It's a $20 fine." I didn't argue. $20 was a small price to pay to be on our way. He wrote the ticket, handed it to me with another patronizing smile, and went back to his truck. He didn't even look at the tracks. We left immediately after, driving back to Ketchikan in silence. The kids fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the disrupted night. Diane and Betty followed in Betty's station wagon. Back home, we tried to make sense of what we'd seen. We agreed not to tell anyone else. Who would believe us? My husband laughed when I told him we'd fled from a bear. I didn't correct him. I knew what I'd seen wasn't a bear. Bears don't pick up axes. They don't examine things with apparent curiosity. They don't have flat faces or walk bipedally for extended periods. For months afterward, I had nightmares about those huffing breaths, that massive shape moving around our shelter. I subscribed to books and magazines about wildlife, searching for any mention of an animal that matched what we'd seen. There was nothing. Diane stopped talking about it entirely after a few weeks. Betty and I would occasionally discuss it when we were alone, piecing together our fragmented memories of those terrifying minutes. "You know what they call things like that in the Pacific Northwest?" Betty said to me once, about a year later. "Sasquatch, Bigfoot, but no one really believes they exist." I did. I believe, because whatever walked into our shelter that night in August 1966 was real. It breathed, it walked, it thought enough to examine our acts with what seemed like intelligence. I've never gone camping again, not once in all these years. The kids grew up thinking their mother was irrationally afraid of bears. My husband still teases me about it sometimes, but I know what I saw at Ward Lake. I know it wasn't a bear. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blows just right, I catch a whiff of that musky, earthy smell, and I'm right back there, frozen in place, watching a creature science says doesn't exist, drag my axe across a wooden floor in the Alaskan wilderness. Story 5. Dim. I killed the engine and let the old Ford coast down the hill, a habit I'd picked up when gas hit $4 a gallon earlier that summer. The truck rumbled quietly as it rolled down Yarder Road, the steering wheel cool under my palms. Hunting season had wrapped up a week earlier, but I still had the rifle in its rack behind me, not that I expected to use it. The road stretched ahead, empty except for the usual potholes and gravel. It was around 4:30 in the afternoon, still light enough in early November, but the shadows were starting to stretch between the thick pines. That's when I saw it, maybe 100 yards ahead, where the road curved near Buckley's old property. At first, I thought it was a black bear, a big one. Biggest damn bear I'd ever seen in 32 years living in Telketna. It was standing on its hind legs, which wasn't unusual for a bear checking its surroundings. But something felt off about it. My truck continued to coast downhill, picking up speed. I tapped the brake lightly, slowing my approach. The shape ahead didn't drop to all fours like a bear would. It just stood there, tall and straight-backed, watching the road. As the distance closed to maybe 70 yards, my brain struggled to make sense of what my eyes were seeing. This wasn't a bear, not even close. This thing was tall, taller than any man I'd ever met. 7, maybe 8 feet high, standing perfectly upright. Its body was covered in black hair, not fur. Straight, clean-looking hair about 6 inches long that seemed to catch what little sunlight filtered through the trees. My stomach tightened. I eased more pressure onto the brake. The truck slowed to a crawl. At 50 yards, I could see its build. Christ, it was muscular, not bulky like a bear, but defined, powerful. The thighs were massive, like tree trunks wrapped in muscle. Its back was ramrod straight, without that V-taper men have at the shoulders. It still hadn't moved from its spot at the edge of the road. At 40 yards, it turned its upper body toward me, twisting at the waist to look directly at my approaching truck. I saw its face clearly then. The features were almost human, but wrong somehow. Fleshy, with no hair on the cheeks or forehead, but a thick black beard hung about 6 inches from its chin. Its eyes caught what little light remained in the day. I'd stopped breathing. My hands clenched the steering wheel so tight my knuckles had gone white. I'd hunted these woods since I was 12. I knew every animal that called Alaska home. This wasn't one of them. When it moved, it didn't lumber like a bear or scramble like a man in a hurry. It walked, smoothly, powerfully, straight into the dense foliage at the side of the road. I noticed its hands then, black, hairless palms, long fingers, not paws, not human hands either. The truck had almost stopped now. I put my foot on the gas and crept forward, eyes fixed on the spot where it had disappeared. The brush was thick there, but something that size should have been visible, should have been pushing branches aside, making noise. There was nothing, no movement, no sound except the idling engine of my truck and my own breathing, which had become shallow and rapid. I drove past the spot slowly, neck craned to see into the trees. Nothing. The creature had vanished completely, though the brush was so thick it couldn't have moved more than 20 feet in. My mind raced through explanations. A man in a costume? Out here, miles from town with no other vehicles around? A bear with some kind of deformity or disease that made it look strange? No bear walks like that, stands like that, has hands like that. I drove the remaining 3 miles home in a daze. The creature's image burned into my mind. Those muscles, that face, those eyes looking right at me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee that went cold, staring into the darkness beyond my yard. I thought about calling Sheriff Tenney, but stopped myself. What would I say? I saw a monster on Yarder Road. I'd be laughed out of town, or worse, people would think I was drunk or high while driving. The next morning, I drove back to the spot. Daylight gave me courage, and I parked at the curve and got out, looking for tracks. The ground was hard packed from lack of rain, and the roadside vegetation showed no obvious path. I pushed into the brush where the creature had disappeared, searching for broken branches, hair samples, anything. After an hour, I gave up. Whatever had been there left no trace. Days passed. I found myself driving Yarder Road at the same time every afternoon, slowing at the curve, eyes searching the trees. Nothing. I started bringing a camera, then a video camera I borrowed from my cousin Pete. Still nothing. After 2 weeks, I changed my route. I couldn't stand seeing that spot anymore, expecting something that never appeared. I began avoiding conversations about hunting or wildlife. When friends asked if I'd seen anything interesting lately, I'd shrug it off or change the subject. I thought about those nature shows where they document Bigfoot sightings. I'd always scoffed at them. Attention seekers and hoaxers, I'd thought. But what I saw wasn't the lumbering, hunched creature from those grainy videos. This thing was different, powerful, athletic, purpose-built. And those eyes, they weren't animal eyes. There was something in them. Intelligence, awareness. One night in December, after too many beers, I almost told my brother Rick. We were sitting in my living room, watching the Seahawks game. During a commercial, he mentioned he was planning a hunting trip up near Montana Creek next fall. "You should be careful up there," I said, the words out before I could stop them. "Careful of what? Bears are denning by then." I took another swig of beer, trying to find the right words. There's weird things in those woods sometimes. Rick laughed. "What, you see a ghost or something?" I forced a laugh. "Nah, just talking shit." I turned the volume up as the game came back on. The moment passed. Months went by. Winter turned to spring, spring to summer. I still thought about what I'd seen every day, but the sharp edge of fear had dulled to a persistent unease. I found myself looking at the world differently. The woods I'd known my whole life now held secrets, possibilities I'd never considered. I began reading about similar sightings. Most were nothing like what I'd seen, too vague, too fantastical, or describing something that sounded more like a man in a suit than a living, breathing creature. But a few accounts sent chills down my spine. Descriptions of tall, powerful beings with straight black hair and unusual strength spotted in remote areas across the Pacific Northwest and Alaska. That summer, I spent more time in the woods than ever before. Not hunting, just watching, listening. I'd sit for hours against a tree, camera ready, eyes scanning. Nothing extraordinary ever showed itself, but I felt different out there, like I was being watched in return. By September 2009, almost a year had passed since my encounter. The anniversary weighed on me. I'd told no one, written nothing down. If I died tomorrow, what I'd seen would die with me. That thought bothered me more than I expected. I was having dinner with Ray Collins, an old hunting buddy, at the Moose Drop Inn, when I finally broke my silence. We'd known each other 30 years, served in the National Guard together. If anyone would give me a fair hearing, it was Ray. "Remember last November when I was acting strange after hunting season?" I asked, keeping my voice low though the restaurant was nearly empty. Ray nodded, chewing his steak. "Yeah. Figured you were having trouble with Karen again. My ex-wife had a habit of stirring up legal issues every few months. Wasn't Karen?" I took a deep breath. "I saw something on Yarder Road, something I can't explain." I told him everything, the height, the muscles, the face, the way it moved. I described how it vanished without a trace, how I'd gone back looking for evidence. Ray listened without interrupting, his expression unchanging. When I finished, he set down his fork and looked me straight in the eyes. "You're serious," he said. It wasn't a question. "Dead serious. I know how it sounds." Ray sipped his beer, thinking. "You know, my uncle worked for the Forest Service up by Denali for 30 years. He used to tell stories, never to the higher-ups, just family. Said there were things in the deep woods the government knows about but won't acknowledge." That night I slept better than I had in months. Over the next few weeks I told 4 more people. My brother didn't believe me, laughed it off as a joke at first, then got uncomfortable when he realized I wasn't kidding. My sister listened quietly and said she didn't disbelieve me, which was as close to support as I could expect. Pete, my cousin, immediately wanted to organize a search party, but I talked him down. The last person I told was Sheriff Tenney, not officially, but over beers at his cabin. He'd heard stories before, he said, more than you'd think from serious people. That fall, I found myself drawn back to Yarder Road and further up toward Montana Creek. I'd developed a theory that the creature had been heading toward the salmon spawning grounds. Bears fattened up there before winter. Why not this thing, whatever it was? I spent weekends camped near the creek, watching from a distance with binoculars. I saw bears, eagles, the occasional moose, nothing unusual. But one evening, as dusk fell and I was packing up to leave, I heard a splash that didn't sound like a bear. Bears are noisy fishermen, splashing and crashing. This was a single, precise splash, followed by silence. I raised my binoculars slowly, scanning the creek in the fading light. There, at the bend where the water pooled deep, something dark moved against the shoreline. I couldn't make out details in the dimness, but I saw an upright figure pull something from the water, probably a salmon, and then retreat quickly into the tree line. My hands shook so badly I dropped the binoculars. By the time I recovered them, whatever I'd seen was gone. I didn't go back to that spot again. Some primal instinct told me I'd pushed my luck far enough. The creature had shown itself twice now. A third time might mean something different. People in town started looking at me differently after word got around about my Bigfoot story. Most thought I was crazy or attention-seeking. A few were genuinely curious. One man, a wildlife biologist passing through, interviewed me for 3 hours, recording everything. He said my description didn't match known Sasquatch accounts. This creature sounded more refined, more adapted than the classic Bigfoot. That winter, I watched the famous Patterson-Gimlin film for the first time since I was a kid. The shambling, hunched figure in that grainy footage looked nothing like what I'd seen. My creature stood straight, moved with purpose, had muscles defined like an Olympic athlete's. The thing in the film looked like a man in a monkey suit compared to the raw power I'd witnessed on Yarder Road. I still drive that road several times a week. I still put my truck in neutral to coast down the hill. Some habits don't die. But I keep my eyes on the trees now, and I keep a camera on the passenger seat, always ready. I've never again seen what I saw that November day, but I know it's out there. People ask me sometimes how the experience changed me. I usually give some vague answer about appreciating nature more. The truth is more complicated. I walk through the world differently now, knowing that our understanding of it is incomplete. Science hasn't catalogued everything. The woods hold secrets that don't fit in textbooks. I don't hunt anymore. Can't bring myself to pull the trigger on anything. Not since I looked into those eyes on Yarder Road and saw something looking back at me. Something intelligent, something that didn't belong to any species I knew. My life divides neatly now, before Yarder Road and after. Before, I was certain about the world and my place in it. After, I live with questions that have no answers. Watching the tree line, listening to the sounds of the forest with new ears, waiting for a glimpse of something that shouldn't exist. But it does exist. I saw it with my own eyes on a fall afternoon in 2008, and nothing anyone says will convince me otherwise. Story 6. I never believed in monsters, not the kind that lived in the woods anyway. But what happened back in 2012 changed everything I thought I knew about the world around us. My name is Sarah Thornton, and this is what happened that summer in Alaska. The morning broke clear and crisp over the Mead River. My 2 boys, Jed and Tyler, were already loading the boat while I packed our lunch cooler. We had a specific destination in mind, a small cabin near the mouth of the river where last night my boys had helped a stranded family with engine trouble. We'd promised to check on them today. "Got the extra gas, Mom?" Jed called out, his voice carrying over the gentle lapping of water against our dock. At 19, he was the spitting image of his father, tall, broad-shouldered, with that same determined set to his jaw. "Already in the boat," I replied, hefting the cooler down the worn wooden steps. "Tyler, did you grab the first aid kit?" Tyler, my younger son at 17, nodded without looking up from securing the life jackets. "Yes, ma'am. Got it under the bench seat." We pushed off just after 9 a.m. The boat's motor sputtered, then caught, sending us skimming across the water's surface. The boys had always been at home on these waters, having grown up spending every summer at our cabin. My husband, Mark, couldn't join us this year. Work had kept him back in town, but we'd be heading home in 4 days for his birthday celebration. The morning sun warmed my face as we navigated the familiar twists of the Mead. Tall pines and spruce trees lined the banks, their reflections dancing on the water's surface. An eagle soared overhead, its wingspan impressive against the blue sky. It was just another beautiful Alaskan day, or so I thought. We'd been on the water for about 40 minutes when I first noticed it. Something dark standing on the hillside to our left. Ruth Hill rose steep and imposing, covered in thick vegetation, but near the top stood something that didn't belong. "Jed," I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "Do you see that, up on Ruth Hill?" Jed followed my gaze, squinting against the sunlight. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Holy shit," he muttered, then quickly glanced at me. "Sorry, Mom, but yeah, I see it. What is that?" By now, Tyler had noticed too. He stood up in the boat, one hand shielding his eyes. "There's more than one," he said. "I can see 3 of them." He was right. 3 massive black figures stood against the green backdrop of the hill. They were too far away to make out details, but I could tell they were huge, far larger than any bear I'd ever seen, and they were standing upright on 2 legs. "Cut the engine," I said, and Jed complied immediately. The sudden silence felt heavy. The creatures didn't move. They just stood there watching us from their perch on Ruth Hill. "Maybe they're hikers," Tyler offered, but his voice lacked conviction. "No hiker is that big," Jed responded, reaching under his seat. I knew he was checking for the rifle we kept stored there. "And no hiker is that color? They're pitch black and they're huge." We drifted for several minutes, all of us staring at the hill. The creatures remained motionless, like sentinels overlooking the river. "Let's keep going," I finally said, my mouth dry. "We promised we'd check on the Millers." Jed hesitated, then nodded and restarted the engine. As we continued down the river, I kept my eyes fixed on the hill. The figures began to move, walking in slow circles around each other, but they stayed in the same general area. They seemed to be using the hill for shelter, occasionally disappearing behind outcroppings, only to reappear moments later. "Are you guys still seeing this?" I asked repeatedly, half hoping they'd tell me I was imagining things. "Yeah, Mom. They're still there," Tyler confirmed each time, his voice tight. After about 20 minutes, I couldn't stand it anymore. I stood up on the boat seat, my heart pounding in my chest, and waved my arms over my head. The creatures stopped their circular pacing. They turned in unison toward our boat, their attention unmistakably fixed on us. But they didn't wave back. They didn't call out. They simply watched. "Mom, what are you doing?" Jed hissed, grabbing my pant leg. "Sit down before you fall in." I lowered myself back onto the seat, a chill running down my spine despite the warmth of the day. "I just wanted to see if they'd respond." "Well, they didn't," Tyler muttered, "and I'm glad. I don't want them coming any closer." We continued our journey, but I couldn't stop looking back at the hill. The creatures remained there, watching our progress down the river. By my estimate, they stood about a mile from the river's edge, yet they were so massive that we could clearly see them even at that distance. "What do you think they are?" Tyler asked after a while. I shook my head. "I don't know." "Bears don't stand like that," Jed said firmly. "Not for that long, and they're too big for bears anyway." The creatures followed our progress for nearly an hour, walking parallel to the river as we made our way toward the mouth. Eventually, a bend in the river took us out of their line of sight. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders once they were no longer visible, but the uneasiness remained. We reached the Miller family's cabin around noon. They were grateful for the extra supplies we'd brought, and their boat engine was running again thanks to Jed's mechanical know-how from the previous night. We stayed for lunch, and though I tried to focus on the conversation, my mind kept drifting back to those three dark figures on the hill. "Everything okay, Sarah?" Linda Miller asked, noticing my distraction. I almost told her then, almost described what we'd seen on our way down the river. But something stopped me. Fear of sounding crazy, perhaps. Or maybe I didn't want to put words to what we'd witnessed, as if speaking about it would make it more real. "Just tired," I lied. "Didn't sleep well last night." We spent several hours with the Millers. The boys helped John Miller chop some wood while I assisted Linda with mending a torn fishing net. All the while, I kept glancing toward the mouth of the river, half expecting to see three massive shadows emerging from the tree line. At around 3 p.m., we said our goodbyes and began our journey back home. The boys were quieter now, and I knew they were thinking about our return trip. We'd have to pass by Ruth Hill again. "They won't still be there," Tyler said, trying to convince himself more than me or Jed. "It's been hours." But as we approached the hill, I found myself holding my breath. My eyes scanned the now familiar slopes, searching for any sign of the three watchers. Nothing moved against the green backdrop. "They're gone," Jed announced, his relief evident. I wasn't so sure. The hill contained numerous caves and outcroppings, places where something large could hide. "I think they went inside the hill," I said quietly. Tyler shot me a look. "Inside, Mum, they're not... They can't be..." "I don't know what they are," I cut him off, "but they were watching us, and now they're not, and I don't think they left the area." We continued upriver in silence, all of us scanning the hillside for any movement. But the creatures, or whatever they were, did not reappear. By the time we reached our cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the water. That night, I locked all the doors and windows of our cabin for the first time ever. I even checked that Jed had loaded the rifle and placed it near his bed. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, my dreams were filled with dark shapes watching from distant hills. The next 3 days passed without incident. We fished, hiked in the opposite direction of Ruth Hill, and prepared to return home for Mark's birthday. Not once did we spot the black figures again, but their presence hung over us like a shadow. We didn't talk about what we'd seen, as if by mutual agreement, but I caught both boys staring at the hill whenever it was visible from our property. On our final morning, as we loaded the boat for our return to the marina where our truck was parked, Tyler finally broke our silence on the matter. "What do you think they were, Mum? Really?" I secured the cooler to the boat floor before answering. "I don't know, honey. They were too big to be bears, too dark to be moose, and they stood and moved like people, but huge people." "Bigfoot," Jed said suddenly. "Sasquatch. That's what everyone calls them." I'd had the same thought, but hearing it spoken aloud sent a shiver through me. "Maybe," I conceded. "I took some pictures with the little camera, but I doubt they'll show much. They were so far away." "But we saw them," Tyler insisted. "All three of us." "Yes," I nodded. "We did." We made it back to the marina without seeing the creatures again. The 4-hour drive home felt like returning to another world, a normal world of highways and gas stations and cell phone reception. When we pulled into our driveway, Mark was waiting on the porch, a grin splitting his face at the sight of us. That night, after the boys had gone to bed and Mark and I sat alone on our back deck, I tried to tell him about what we'd seen. He listened patiently, his forehead creased with concern, but I could tell he didn't believe me. Not really. He suggested bears, or even people in dark clothing, the distance playing tricks on our perception of size. The pictures didn't turn out, I told him, disappointed, but not surprised. Just blurry dark spots against the hillside. Could be anything. Mark squeezed my hand. "Maybe that's for the best, Sarah. Some things are better left as personal experiences." I nodded, but his words didn't comfort me. What we'd seen was real. The creatures on Ruth Hill had been real. Weeks passed, then months. The experience faded somewhat, pushed aside by the routines of daily life. But it never left me entirely. I found myself researching late at night, tales of Sasquatch sightings, encounters with unexplained creatures in the wilderness. Most sounded like hoaxes or misidentifications, but some rang true. They described the same feeling of being watched, the same unnerving sense that you were in the presence of something that shouldn't exist. It wasn't until late 2012, almost 6 months after our encounter, that I finally admitted to myself what we had seen. I was watching a documentary about Sasquatch sightings in the Pacific Northwest when they showed a computer-generated image of what witnesses described. The similarity to our hillside watchers was undeniable. The massive bulk, the way they moved, the dark coloration. "We saw Sasquatch," I whispered to my empty living room. 3 of them. The next day, I sat both boys down and showed them the documentary. Their reactions confirmed what I already knew. We had all seen the same thing, 3 Sasquatch beings watching us from Ruth Hill. "I knew it," Jed said, his voice quiet. "I knew they weren't bears." Tyler just nodded, his face pale. "Do you think they're still there? On that hill?" "I don't know," I answered honestly, "but I think they've always been there, and they'll be there long after we're gone. We've never told anyone else about what we saw that day. The blurry photos sit in a drawer in my desk, evidence that would convince no one. But the 3 of us know what we witnessed. Sometimes on quiet nights, I find myself thinking about those massive watchers. Were they curious about us? Territorial? Or simply observing as they perhaps have done for centuries? The feeling of being watched never fully left me after that day on the Mead River. Sometimes, even now when I'm walking alone in the woods near our home, I get that same prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I turn, half expecting to see 3 dark figures standing motionless among the trees. I never do, but I know they're out there somewhere, and they're watching. Story 7. The wind cut through my parka like it was made of paper. February in Alaska doesn't forgive mistakes. I'd made this run between Chevak and Hooper Bay dozens of times on my Polaris snow machine. The Pymute Trail stretched out before me, a white ribbon cutting through the vast emptiness of the tundra. My name's Marcus Scam. I've lived in these parts my whole life. 32 years of harsh winters and brief summers. Never believed in monsters until 2011. The sky hung low and grey that afternoon. I'd left Chevak around 2, figuring I'd make Hooper Bay before dark. My cousin Darrell needed some parts for his boat motor, and I had business in town anyway. Nothing unusual about the trip. The temperature sat at -15, and the snow had stopped falling earlier that morning, leaving good visibility across the flat terrain. I'd been riding for about 40 minutes when I first spotted it. A dark figure standing along the trail maybe a quarter-mile ahead. Not unusual to see travelers out here, though most folks know better than to stop for long in this cold. I figured someone had broken down and needed help. I eased back on the throttle, slowing from 45 to about 30. As I got within 200 yards, something felt wrong. The figure stood too still, didn't wave or move toward me like a stranded traveler would, just stood there, facing away from me, toward Hooper Bay. Probably just taking a piss, I muttered to myself, my breath fogging inside my helmet. At 100 yards, the wrongness grew stronger. The figure was tall, too tall, had to be over 7 feet, and something about its proportions seemed off. The arms hung down past where knees should be. I slowed to 20, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. At 80 feet, I could see it was covered in something. Not a parka or snowsuit, something that looked like hair or fur, brown shaggy stuff that reminded me of muskox fur but darker. No human would be out here dressed like that. No human could survive more than minutes without proper gear. My hands gripped the handlebars tighter. I veered right, giving the figure a wide berth. I didn't want to stop, didn't want to get any closer than I had to. But curiosity kept me from gunning the engine and racing past. 60 feet away now. The thing hadn't acknowledged me yet, hadn't turned or moved at all, just stood there, impossibly still in the bitter cold. I could see more details now. The fur or hair covered its entire body. Its back was broad, hunched slightly. No backpack, no gear, nothing to suggest it was human. At 40 feet, I knew I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. Its legs were thick like tree trunks, planted firmly in 3 feet of snow, without sinking in like a person would. The brown fur had patterns to it, darker in some places, especially along what I guessed was its spine. 30 feet. I was moving slow now, barely 15 miles per hour. My engine's rumble echoed across the empty tundra. No way it couldn't hear me. Yet it remained motionless, facing away. 20 feet. My heart pounded so hard I felt dizzy. Every instinct screamed at me to floor it, to race away from this wrong thing standing on the trail. That's when it finally moved. The head turned first, rotating too far, too smoothly for a human neck. Then the body followed, pivoting without moving its feet. I saw its face, or what passed for one, mostly covered in the same brown fur, with a flatter nose than any person I'd ever seen. But the eyes. God, the eyes. They glowed red. Not reflected red like an animal's eyes in headlights. They glowed from within, like coals in a dying fire. Those eyes locked onto mine. I felt the connection like a physical blow. Something ancient and hungry looked out through those eyes, something that had no business existing in this world. I didn't think. My hand cranked the throttle all the way. The snow machine lurched forward, the engine screaming as I pushed it beyond what was safe. I didn't look back. Didn't need to. I felt those eyes on me as I tore away down the trail. The speedometer hit 60, then 70. Too fast for the uneven trail, but fear drove me harder than sense. My machine caught air over a small ridge, slamming down hard enough to rattle my teeth. I kept going, the wind and snow tearing at my face through the gap in my helmet. I made it to Hooper Bay in record time, pulled up to Darrell's place with my hands shaking so bad I could barely turn off the engine. He took one look at me and knew something was wrong. "Jesus, Marcus, "You look like you've seen a ghost." I stumbled inside, collapsed in his kitchen chair. Couldn't get warm, despite the wood stove blasting heat. When I finally told him what I'd seen, he didn't laugh like I expected. His face went serious, the way older folks do when talk turns to the old stories. "Hairy man," he said quietly. "My grandfather saw one, out past the old fishing camp. Said it stood 8 feet tall with arms that hung to the ground." I shook my head. "This can't be real, Darryl. I must have seen a bear or something." "Bears don't stand on 2 legs in winter. They don't have red eyes." He poured me a cup of coffee, added a splash of whiskey. "You're not the first to see it. Won't be the last." I stayed in Hooper Bay that night. Didn't want to make the return trip in the dark. Didn't want to make it alone at all. Darryl arranged for his nephew Caleb to ride back with me the next day. "Safety in numbers," he said. The next morning, with sunlight brightening the snow, the whole thing seemed ridiculous. I'd seen a bear, or maybe another traveler in unusual gear. The red eyes were a trick of light, or my imagination. Had to be. Caleb and I made it back to Chevak without incident. The spot where I'd seen the creature looked ordinary. No tracks, no sign anything had stood there. I began to doubt myself. But that night, the dreams started. Those red eyes watching me, getting closer each time. I'd wake up sweating despite the cold room. A week passed. I avoided traveling alone, made excuses to stay in town. When I had to go out, I carried my rifle across my lap, loaded and ready. Folks noticed the change in me. Old Roy Cooper caught me checking the locks on my door 3 times one night. "Something got you spooked, boy?" he asked. I hesitated, then told him. Expected him to laugh, to call me crazy. Instead, he nodded slowly, his weathered face growing serious. "Need to talk to the elders," he said. "They know about these things." 2 days later, Roy brought me to Walter Joseph's house. Walter was 83, one of the oldest men in the region. His living room smelled of tobacco and dried fish. 3 other elders sat with him, all men who'd lived their entire lives in these lands. I told my story again. No one interrupted. When I finished, Walter spoke. "My father called them the hidden people. They've always been here before our people, before the white men. They keep to themselves mostly, stay in the high country away from humans. But sometimes, in winter, when food grows scarce, they come down to the lowlands." Another elder, Peter Nanok, nodded. "They're not evil, not like white men's devils. They're just different. They live by different rules, but they can be dangerous, especially if they're hungry or if you disturb their places." "What was it doing on the trail?" I asked. Walter shrugged. "Marking territory maybe, warning us away, or hunting." "Hunting what?" The old men exchanged glances. Finally, Walter answered, "Whatever crosses their path." They told me more. How the creatures, the hairy men, as most locals called them, had been spotted for generations. How they moved without leaving tracks sometimes. How they could stand the coldest temperatures without protection. How they were stronger than 10 men. "Always travel with others," Peter advised. "They rarely approach groups and carry protection." "My rifle?" I asked. "That won't help much," Walter said. "I mean these." He handed me a small pouch made of sealskin. Inside were strange items: a raven's feather, a piece of seal bone carved with symbols, a small chunk of iron. "Keep it with you when you travel," he said. "It won't stop them, but it might make them think twice about following you." I took the pouch, not fully believing, but not willing to refuse the old man's gift. I thanked them and left, more confused than before. Word spread about my encounter. Some people laughed it off, said I'd seen a moose or gotten snowblind. Others got quiet, nodded knowingly. A few shared their own stories. Jim Atler had seen one while checking his trapline 3 winters back. Sarah Kashatok's grandfather had been followed by something that left enormous tracks for 2 days during a hunting trip in the 60s. Gradually, I noticed changes in the community. People avoided the Paimayute Trail after dark. Travelers began moving in pairs or groups. Children were called in earlier when the sun set. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew something was out there. 4 weeks after my encounter, I finally worked up the courage to travel that route again. Daylight, clear weather, and I brought 2 friends with rifles. We rode 3 abreast down the trail, eyes scanning the horizon. Nothing unusual happened. Part of me felt relieved. Another part felt watched the entire time. Spring came. The days grew longer, snow began to melt, and the fear faded a bit. I still carried Walter's pouch, still avoided traveling alone when possible, but life returned to something close to normal. Then, in late April, with most of the snow gone and the tundra turning from white to brown, I found the tracks. I'd been checking some family fishing equipment stored about 5 miles outside Chevak when I saw them. Enormous footprints pressed into the mud near the storage shed. 18 inches long at least. 5 toes, but not shaped like human feet. Wider across the front, with what looked like claws extending from each toe. The tracks led from the tree line, circled the shed, then returned to the trees. I followed them to the edge of the woods, then stopped. Something told me going further would be a mistake. I reported what I'd found to Walter. He came out to see for himself, brought Peter and 2 younger men. They examined the tracks in silence, occasionally murmuring to each other in Yupik too quietly for me to hear. "It's curious," Walter finally said, checking us out. "What do we do?" I asked. "Respect its space. Don't leave food out. Travel carefully." He looked at the tree line. "And remember that this is their land too. We just live on it." That night I sat on my porch watching the sunset. The wind rustled through the stunted trees surrounding Chevak. In the distance, a wolf howled, the sound echoing across the tundra. I fingered the pouch Walter had given me, wondering if it really held any power against the thing I'd seen. I thought about those red eyes, about how old they had seemed, how alien. Not evil, maybe, like Peter had said, but not benevolent either, just other. Something that lived by rules and purposes I couldn't understand. I've seen the Harry Man one more time since then, last winter during a storm. Just a silhouette watching me from a ridge as I hurried home on my snow machine. It didn't approach, and I didn't stop. A mutual understanding, maybe. The elders say they've always been here, these creatures. Will always be here. Part of this harsh land, like the mountains and the snow and the endless winter darkness. Most outsiders don't believe. They call our stories superstition or mistake or imagination. But I know what I saw on Paimayute Trail. I know those eyes were real. And on cold nights when the wind howls across the tundra, I check my locks an extra time, keep Walter's pouch close, and remind myself, we are not alone in this wilderness. Never have been. And the things that share it with us don't always want to be seen. Story 8. I was supposed to be compiling health records that day. It was mundane work, but necessary in our small Napakiak village. Most outsiders can't find us on a map, tucked away in northern Alaska, where winter darkness stretches for months. My name is Elena Thompson, and I've lived here my entire 32 years. I know every face, every building, every trail. That's why what I saw made no sense. The community building where I worked sat on a small rise, giving a clear view across the frozen slough to the bluff on the opposite side. The large windows let in precious winter light, making it the best place to work during the short daylight hours. I was alone in the records room when I glanced up, my eyes needing a break from the small print of medical forms. That's when I spotted it. At first, I thought it was a shadow trick, the way the low winter sun plays with perception. But then it moved. On top of the bluff stood a figure. It walked on 2 legs, but something was immediately wrong. The brush on top of the bluff reaches about 7 feet at its tallest point. This thing It towered over the brush, 9, maybe 10 feet tall. Dark brown against the white snow, it moved with a fluid stride that wasn't quite human, too smooth, too controlled for its size. I dropped my pen. It rolled across the desk and clattered to the floor. I couldn't look away long enough to pick it up. The figure paused, as if sensing my attention. Then it stepped behind a cluster of taller brush and disappeared. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stood up, knocking my chair back, and pressed against the window. The cold glass fogged around my breath as I scanned the bluff edge. Nothing. "Hey, Linda!" I called out, my voice cracking. "Linda, can you come here a second?" Linda Wasker, our receptionist, appeared in the doorway. "What's up? You look like you've seen a ghost." "There's something on the bluff," I said, pointing. "Something big." Linda joined me at the window. "I don't see anything." "It was there, just a minute ago, taller than a person, way taller." She squinted. "Probably just a moose, standing up weird. The light plays tricks this time of year." "It was walking on 2 legs, Linda." She gave me a sideways glance. "You sure you're not just tired? It's been a long week." I was about to argue when the figure reappeared. It emerged from behind the brush, continuing its path along the bluff top. "There!" I grabbed Linda's arm. "Look!" Her body stiffened beside me. "What the hell is that?" The confirmation that someone else saw it sent ice through my veins. It wasn't a hallucination. It was real. "Get the others," I said. Linda didn't move, transfixed by the dark figure stalking along the bluff. "Linda," I snapped, "get the others, now!" She blinked, then hurried from the room. I kept my eyes locked on the creature, afraid it would vanish again. It continued walking, its gait steady and purposeful. Something about the way it moved seemed deliberate, like it was patrolling, searching. Within minutes, the small records room filled with my co-workers. 8 of us crowded around the windows, all staring at the impossible figure. "That ain't human," muttered Jim Kartak, our maintenance man. "Too big," agreed Sarah Okacock, a nurse. "Way too big." "Could be someone in a costume," suggested Ben Morris, though his voice lacked conviction. "Who the hell would be wandering around in a 10-foot costume in 15-degree weather?" Jim shot back. As we watched, the creature stopped again. It seemed to be looking down the slope of the bluff. That's when I noticed the children. About 5 kids from the village were sledding down the gentler part of the bluff, maybe 200 yards from where the creature stood. My stomach knotted. "The children," I breathed. "They're right there." We all tensed, uncertain what to do. Should we run out there? Call out? The creature hadn't made any threatening moves, but its very existence felt like a threat. The decision was made for us when one of the children, little Annie Clark, looked up the bluff while climbing back up for another sled run. She froze mid-step. Even from this distance, I could see the moment she spotted the creature. Her small body went rigid. Then she screamed. The sound didn't reach us through the windows, but we saw her mouth open wide. She dropped her sled and began running down the slope away from the bluff. The other children looked up, saw what she'd seen, and scattered like startled birds. They abandoned their sleds, stumbling and sliding down the snowy incline, all racing toward the village. "We need to call someone," Sarah said, reaching for her phone. "And say what?" Jim demanded. "There's a giant walking on the bluff. Who'd believe that?" "Look," Ben pointed, "someone's coming." A snowmobiler appeared on the trail that cut along the base of the bluff. The rider was bundled against the cold, face obscured by a helmet and mask. They drove steadily along the packed snowpath, unaware of what loomed above. The creature's reaction was immediate and chilling. It dropped to a crouch, lowering its massive frame against the snow. The movement was fluid, deliberate, intelligent. It was hiding. We watched in stunned silence as the snowmobile passed directly beneath the creature's position. The driver never looked up, continuing along the trail until they disappeared around the curve toward the village. Once the snowmobile was gone, the creature rose back to its full height. It stood motionless for several long seconds, its dark form stark against the white landscape. Then it turned and walked away from the edge, disappearing into the thicker brush that covered the top of the bluff. It hid, Sarah whispered. It knew to hide. A heavy silence fell over our group. Whatever we'd just witnessed wasn't an animal acting on instinct. It had demonstrated awareness, intelligence. "We should go look," Jim finally said. "Check for tracks." No one jumped at his suggestion. "I'll go with you," I said, surprising myself. Ben nodded. "Me too. Better than sitting here wondering." We bundled up, pulling on parkas and boots from the coat room. As we stepped outside, the bitter cold slapped at any exposed skin. The sun was already dipping toward the horizon, though it was only mid-afternoon. We trudged across the frozen slough, our boots crunching through the crusty top layer of snow. No one spoke. What was there to say? We'd all seen it, but putting words to the experience seemed impossible. It took us 20 minutes to cross the slough and reach the trail at the base of the bluff. Already the light was fading, casting long shadows across the snow. "Where was it standing?" Ben asked, scanning the bluff top. "There," I pointed to a spot where the brush thinned out. "That's where I first saw it." Jim nodded. "Let's climb up. Careful on the slope. It's icy." We made our way up the bluff, using small spruce trees and exposed roots as handholds. The snow was packed hard from repeated freezing and thawing, making the climb treacherous. By the time we reached the top, my gloves were crusted with snow, and my legs burned from the effort. "Spread out," Jim directed. "Look for tracks or broken branches." We moved cautiously across the bluff top, keeping within sight of each other. The bare branches of brush scratched against my parka as I pushed through them. After about 10 minutes of searching, Ben called out, "Over here!" Jim and I converged on his position. Ben stood staring down at the snow, his face pale beneath his hat. "Look at these," he said. In the fading light, I could make out a series of impressions in the snow. They were partially melted from the day's sun, distorting their original shape, but one thing was unmistakable. They were enormous. Each impression was easily 20 inches long, with what looked like 5 distinct toe marks at one end. "Those ain't human," Jim said, his voice tight, "and they ain't from any animal I know." I knelt down, careful not to disturb the tracks. "They're bipedal. Look at the pattern." The footprints formed a clear walking path, left, right, left, just like a human would make, except no human had feet this size. "Whatever made these was heavy too," Ben observed. "See how deep they are even in this packed snow?" A gust of wind swirled snow around us, and I suddenly became very aware of our vulnerability. Night was approaching. We were standing exactly where the creature had been. "We should go," I said, standing quickly. "It's getting dark." No one argued. We made our way back down the bluff in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Before we reached the bottom, I turned for one last look at the top. The brush moved slightly in the wind, and for a heart-stopping moment I thought I saw a dark shape among the branches. Just the gathering shadows, I told myself, but I didn't linger to confirm. When we returned to the community building, the others were waiting anxiously. "Did you find anything?" Linda asked. "Tracks," Jim said. "Big ones." We described what we'd found, our voices low as if we were afraid of being overheard. As we talked, Sarah's phone rang. "It's Deborah Clark," she said, glancing at the screen before answering. "Hello? Yes, we're still at the office." "What? Slow down, Deborah. Is Annie okay?" We all fell silent, watching Sarah's face as she listened. "She's not hurt, just scared. Okay. Yes, we saw it too." "No, I don't know what it was." She paused, listening. 8 of us saw it, Deborah. It was real." After she hung up, Sarah explained that Annie Clark was hysterical. She and the other children had seen the creature clearly, According to Annie, it was dark brown and not human. The children were all refusing to go near their windows, afraid the creature would see them. Deborah says half the village is calling each other, Sarah added. The kids ran home screaming about a monster on the bluff. By nightfall, the story had spread through the entire village. Some believed it, many didn't. Those who hadn't seen it themselves dismissed it as mass hysteria or a practical joke. But the 8 of us who stood at that window knew what we saw. And the children knew too. The next day, not a single child walked to school alone. Parents accompanied them, many carrying rifles. The usual paths that crossed near the bluff were abandoned in favor of longer routes through the center of the village. Over the next few weeks, the fear gradually subsided for most of the village. No further sightings were reported, and life began to return to normal. But the children who had been sledding that day remained terrified. For more than a month, parents had to escort them to and from school. None would go near the bluff. As for me and my 7 co-workers who witnessed it together, we formed a bond that's hard to explain to outsiders. When others in the village doubt our story or offer rational explanations, we exchange glances that say more than words could. We know what we saw. Jim, Ben, and I returned to the bluff several times in the following days. The tracks had disappeared under fresh snow, and we never found any other evidence. But sometimes, when I'm working late at the community building and dusk settles over the landscape, I find myself drawn to the window. I scan the bluff edge, part of me dreading and part of me hoping to catch another glimpse of the dark figure that towered over the brush that winter day. Whatever it was intelligent enough to hide, aware enough to avoid detection. And sometimes I wonder, if it was smart enough to hide once, isn't it smart enough to hide always? But one thing I know for certain. On a frozen January afternoon, something not human walked the bluff across from our village. 8 adults and 5 children saw it. The tracks proved it was there, and I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching and waiting in the vast Alaskan wilderness that surrounds our tiny village. Some nights, when the wind howls across the slough and scratches at my windows, I lie awake wondering if it's looking back at me through the darkness. Because the most terrifying part isn't what we saw that day. It's knowing that it saw us too. Story 9. The motor of my ATV hummed beneath me as I made my way down the familiar path to the beach. July 4th, 2014. Independence Day for most Americans, but just another morning for me, Bosco Olson Sr., heading out to check for driftwood along the shoreline below Hooper Bay. The Alaskan summer air felt crisp against my face as I navigated the well-worn trail, the time around 8:30 a.m. according to my watch. The beach came into view, stretching out grey and vast beneath the overcast sky. The tide was out, exposing wide swathes of sand and rock. I'd made this trip hundreds of times before, scanning the shore for usable driftwood to collect. Nothing unusual about today, I thought. Nothing to separate it from any other morning. I noticed the walrus carcass right away. Hard not to. The massive dead animal had washed up sometime in early spring, and by July it had become a rotting landmark on our beach. Most locals gave it a wide berth due to the stench. Today something caught my eye near that putrid pile of decaying blubber and bone. About 300 yards from where I idled on my ATV, I spotted movement on either side of the carcass. Something bobbed up and down, appearing and disappearing behind the massive body. My first thought was ravens, or maybe some other scavengers, making a meal of what remained. Made sense. Nature taking its course. I killed the engine and sat there, squinting through the morning light. The bobbing continued, rhythmic almost. Too big for birds, I realized, too deliberate in its movements. Curiosity got the better of me. I dismounted my ATV and walked closer, making sure to stay downwind of the rank odor. As I approached, the bobbing motion became clearer, but not more identifiable. Whatever was behind that walrus was large, much larger than any coastal wildlife I'd expect to see. I stopped about 150 yards away, far enough to maintain safety but close enough to observe. The movement continued, a dark shape rising and falling on either side of the carcass. I checked my watch again, 8:45 a.m. The thing, whatever it was, seemed unaware of my presence or unconcerned by it. For over 30 minutes I stood motionless, watching. The longer I stayed, the more certain I became that this wasn't normal animal behavior. The bobbing had a purpose to it, like something peeking over the carcass, checking if the coast was clear. Each time the dark mass rose, it seemed to pause, as if scanning the beach. Then it would disappear again. Maybe it was looking at me. Maybe it was eating. At 9:23 a.m., I remember checking my watch. Everything changed. The creature stood up. My breath caught in my throat. What rose from behind that rotting walrus wasn't anything I recognized from 40 years of living in Alaska. Not a bear, not a moose, not any animal I'd ever encountered in these parts. It was massive, tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more. Its body was broad and muscular, covered in dark hair or fur that appeared matted in some places. The lower portions of its legs were brownish, like it had been wading in mud or shallow water. What struck me most were the proportions, all wrong for a human, but too human-like for an animal. I could make out details that burned themselves into my memory. Knobby knees, large hands clenched into fists. The hair or fur on its upper body seemed raised, giving it an even more imposing silhouette against the grey morning sky. Its shoulders were impossibly wide, tapering to a waist that, while thick, was narrower in proportion. The creature turned toward me. Even from this distance, I felt its gaze lock onto mine. The hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood up. This wasn't just an animal sighting. This was a confrontation. For what felt like 5 excruciating minutes, we stared at each other, neither moving, neither backing down. There was intelligence in that standoff, a calculation happening behind whatever eyes were studying me from that dark face. The creature's stance seemed to issue a challenge. This is my territory. What are you going to do about it? I didn't move a muscle. Didn't dare. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Finally, the creature broke our staring contest. It turned away and began walking north along the beach, away from me but parallel to the shoreline. Its gait was strange, fluid but covering ground with unnaturally long strides. Each step measured what had to be 4 or 5 feet. It moved with purpose, heading toward a pile of driftwood about 50 yards up the beach. When it reached the pile, the creature bent down and selected a log, a thick piece of driftwood about the length of a man. What happened next made my skin crawl. With one hand, it lifted the log that would have taken 2 grown men to carry. The creature turned and walked back toward the walrus carcass, carrying the massive piece of wood as if it weighed nothing. Back at the walrus, it positioned the log underneath the carcass and began using it as a lever, attempting to turn the dead animal over. The walrus must have weighed over a ton, even in its decomposed state. The log bent under the pressure but didn't break. The creature adjusted its position, trying different angles, working with clear intention. My mind finally caught up with what my eyes were seeing. The camera. I had my digital camera in my ATV storage compartment. Moving slowly, never turning my back, I retreated to my vehicle and retrieved it. My hands shook as I turned it on and pointed it toward the beach scene. I started recording. The creature continued its work with the log, trying to flip the walrus. Through the viewfinder, I could see more details, the powerful muscles working beneath its dark covering, the determined set of its hunched shoulders. It paused occasionally, readjusting its grip or trying a new angle of leverage. For 15 minutes, I recorded until my memory card filled up. The storage full message flashed, and I lowered the camera, continuing to watch with my naked eyes. The creature grew visibly frustrated. It pushed harder on the log, grunting with effort, the first sound I'd heard it make. The noise carried across the beach, a deep, throaty sound unlike anything I'd heard from man or beast. When the carcass refused to budge after several more attempts, the creature straightened up and slammed its fist against the walrus hide. The impact made a dull, thudding sound that I could hear even from my position. That's when I noticed the change in its demeanor. The creature's body language shifted from focused determination to agitation. Its head swiveled back toward me, and even from this distance, I felt a new hostility in its attention. It was time to leave. I backed up slowly toward my ATV, never turning my back on the beach. The creature watched me, its massive form still and attentive. I reached my vehicle, climbed on with deliberate movements, and started the engine. The familiar rumble provided little comfort. I turned the ATV around and began driving away at a measured pace, not so fast as to trigger a chase response, but steady enough to put distance between us. Every few seconds, I looked back over my shoulder. The creature remained by the walrus, watching me retreat. The ride home felt endless. Every noise in the brush alongside the trail made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to move. I kept checking behind me, half expecting to see that dark figure with its impossible stride following my tracks. I reached home, parked the ATV, and went inside. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I tried to explain to my wife what I'd seen, but the words came out jumbled and frantic. I connected my camera to the computer, desperate to show her the proof, but when the video played back, the distance and the quality made the figure less distinct than what I'd seen with my own eyes. Still visible, still unexplainable, but somehow less convincing on the small screen. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of our house, every wind gust against the windows, had me sitting upright in bed. What had I seen? What was out there on our beach? The next morning, July 5th, I went back. I wasn't sure why. To confirm what I'd seen, maybe, or to convince myself it had been some kind of hallucination. This time, I brought my shotgun. The beach looked ordinary in the morning light. Waves lapped at the shore. Seagulls circled overhead. I approached the walrus carcass cautiously, shotgun ready, eyes scanning the horizon and the tree line. The creature was gone. The driftwood log still lay beside the carcass, evidence that yesterday hadn't been a dream. I studied the sand around the area, looking for footprints, but the night tide had washed most of the beach clean. I moved closer to examine the walrus. That's when I saw it. Sticking out from a fold in the decomposing flesh was the handle of a knife. A steak knife. The kind you'd find in any home in Hooper Bay. I pulled it free, careful to touch only the very end of the handle. The blade was covered in the putrid gore of the walrus. Looking more closely at the carcass, I noticed something else. A section of the neck area, about 1.5 feet long, had been cut away, not torn by scavengers or natural decomposition, but cut. The marks were long and ragged, like something had used the knife to saw through the tough hide and blubber. I bent down to examine the meat that remained. The smell was overwhelming, rancid and sickeningly sweet. No local would touch meat in this condition. We know better. Whatever had been cutting at this carcass either didn't know or didn't care about the dangers of consuming rotten meat. I took the knife, careful not to disturb any evidence that might be on it, and placed it in a Ziploc bag I had in my pocket. Here was physical proof. Not just a blurry video that could be dismissed, but an actual object that connected the human world with whatever I had encountered. Back at home, I sealed the bagged knife inside a plastic container and placed it in my shed. I didn't know what to do with it. Who would believe me? What authority handles reports of giant, unknown creatures using tools on a remote Alaskan beach? Days passed. I went about my routine, fishing, checking crab pots, gathering driftwood. But I never went to the beach alone anymore, and I always carried my shotgun. Every time I heard a branch snap in the woods or noticed unusual tracks in the soft ground, My mind went back to that morning, to those minutes of silent confrontation with something that shouldn't exist. 2 weeks after the encounter, I finally showed the video to my brother. He watched it 3 times, his expression growing more serious with each viewing. "You know what people will say," he told me, "that it's a bear standing on its hind legs, or a man in a suit playing a prank." "It wasn't a bear," I said, "and no man moves like that." He nodded slowly. "I believe you, Bosco, but others won't." I kept the knife in its container, untouched. Sometimes I thought about turning it over to someone, a university researcher maybe, or a wildlife officer. But the fear of ridicule held me back. And something else too, a strange sense of connection to whatever I had seen that day, like we had shared a secret that the rest of the world wasn't ready for. The locals had stories, of course. Every indigenous community in Alaska has tales of strange creatures in the wilderness. Bushmen, they sometimes called them, or other names in native languages. I'd always listened to these stories with polite skepticism. Now I found myself seeking them out, comparing details with what I had witnessed. The walrus carcass eventually washed away in a storm later that summer. The beach returned to normal, but I never did. Every trip to gather driftwood became an exercise in hyper-vigilance. Every unexpected sound in the forest set my heart racing. Months passed, then a year. I kept the video on a flash drive but rarely watched it. The knife remained in its container in my shed, physical evidence of an impossible encounter. Sometimes in the deep winter, when the darkness stretches long and the wind howls against the walls of our house, I think about those 5 minutes of silent confrontation on the beach, about the intelligence I saw in that encounter, about the tool use, the log as a lever, the knife for cutting meat. Whatever was on that beach that July 4th morning wasn't just some unknown animal. It was something that thought, planned, and adapted, something that used what humans made for its own purposes, something that existed in the shadows between our world and the wilderness. I still check for driftwood on that beach. I still hunt and fish in the areas around Hooper Bay. But I'm never alone now, and I'm always watching the tree line, the shadows between the trunks, the places where something large could hide. Because now I know we aren't the only ones watching. We aren't the only ones learning from what we observe. And somewhere out there, perhaps watching me even as I go about my daily life, is a creature that has learned to use our tools. A creature that knows my face as well as I know its silhouette. A creature that, like me, is waiting to see what happens next. Story 10. I still taste the copper in my mouth when I remember that day. My heart hammering against my ribs, legs burning as I sprinted across that dirt road, convinced I wouldn't make it home alive. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Eliza Mitchell. I'm a research scientist now, specializing in wildlife biology, but back then, I was just a skinny kid from St. Clair County, Alabama, living in a creaky farmhouse at the base of Chandler Mountain. Our property had been in the family since before the Civil War, nestled in a hollow where the morning fog clung to the ground until nearly noon most days. Great-Grandma Mabel lived with us until I was 11. She was an odd old woman with hands like twisted roots and eyes that seemed to see things the rest of us couldn't. Folks around those parts called her a granny woman, one of those old Appalachian healers who knew which plants could cure a fever and which ones would stop your heart. She'd take me down to the creek that ran behind our property, a good half-mile through dense woods. "Come on, girl," she'd say, her voice scratchy as sandpaper. "Bring that bucket of scraps." I'd trail behind her, lugging kitchen leavings, apple cores, bacon fat, cornbread, wondering why we couldn't just use a compost pile like normal people. At the creek, there was this massive oak stump, hollowed out in the middle. Great-Grandma would have me dump the scraps there. "This is for the woolly boogers," she'd tell me, completely serious. "They've been here longer than us, and they'll be here after we're gone." I nodded like I believed her. But really, I figured it was just another of her superstitions, like never sweeping after dark or putting a knife under the bed to cut the pain of childbirth. When great-grandma died, nobody kept up the trips to the creek. Dad worked long hours at the paper mill in Talladega, and Mom was busy with my little brothers. I got older, discovered boys and books, and started planning my escape from St. Clair County. I was 17 that summer, the summer everything changed. It was July, hot as blazes, and I'd rediscovered the creek as a quiet place to read without my brothers pestering me. I brought my dog-eared copy of The Stand and settled on a flat rock by the water. The day had that heavy quality that comes before a storm. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering, just the gentle gurgle of creek water over stones and the occasional plop of a frog jumping in. I'd been reading for maybe an hour when the hairs on my arm stood up. Something moved in the trees across the creek, not the normal movement of branches in the wind. There wasn't any wind that day. This was deliberate, methodical. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It looked like a shadow sliding between trees, but bigger than any animal I knew lived in those woods. Great-grandma's voice echoed in my head. If something ever feels wrong in these woods, you don't wait around to find out what it is. You head home, and you don't run unless I tell you to. I marked my page, stuffed my book in my backpack, and started walking, not running, back toward the trail that led home. My mouth had gone dry. The silence in the forest felt oppressive now, like the woods were holding their breath. Halfway up the trail, I stopped to retie my shoelace. That's when I noticed it. The forest hadn't just fallen silent, it had developed a pattern. When I moved, there was sound. When I stopped, everything stopped, perfectly timed to my movements. I was being stalked. My hand shook as I finished with my shoe. I stood up slowly, forcing myself to breathe normally, though my lungs felt like they were filling with concrete. I walked 10 more steps, then deliberately stopped again. The sound to my left, a subtle, crushed leaf sound, stopped exactly when I did. Not a second later, as would happen with an echo or an animal that noticed I'd stopped. It stopped precisely with me. I swallowed hard and continued walking, faster now but still not running. The trail curved through a stand of pines, then opened into a section of younger trees where visibility was better. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with just one something. There were 2 of them. The one on my left moved on all 4s, not like a bear or coyote, but like something that could walk upright but chose not to. I caught glimpses of dark hair or fur through the undergrowth. To my right, about 30 yards away, something definitely bipedal kept pace with me, staying just out of clear sight. My breath came in short gasps now. I considered screaming, but knew we were too far from the house for anyone to hear me. The old dirt road was still a quarter-mile ahead. Then I heard it, not with my ears, but somehow inside my head, clear as day. Do not turn around. I nearly tripped over my own feet. The voice wasn't mine. It wasn't even really a voice, more like a command that bypassed my ears entirely. The thing on my left was getting closer. I could hear its breathing now, heavy, with occasional animalistic snorts. It had changed its posture, rising up to walk on 2 legs. The cracking of twigs and rustling of leaves told me it was closing in. Up ahead, the trees thinned, revealing the dirt road that would lead me back to the main highway, just 100 yards more. The internal voice came again, more urgent this time. Run! I bolted, my backpack slapped against my spine as my feet pounded the path. Behind me, something crashed through the underbrush, something big and fast, but instead of coming directly after me, it veered right toward the other creature. There was a sound like 2 freight trains colliding, wood splintering, a deep guttural roar that no human throat could make, and a higher-pitched screech that raised every hair on my body. I didn't look back. I hit the dirt road running and didn't stop until I reached the highway. A passing trucker nearly jackknifed his rig when I burst out of the tree line, wild-eyed and gasping. I told my parents I'd seen a black bear. Dad got his rifle and some neighbors, but they found nothing except broken branches and some unusual tracks that the rain washed away before anyone could photograph them. I didn't go back to the creek after that. Not that summer, not the next. I left for college at Auburn that fall, then grad school in Montana, putting as much distance between myself and Chandler Mountain as I could. It was 12 years later when I first heard about Sasquatch on a late-night podcast. The descriptions, the way they move, their ability to stay hidden, the strange mind-speak some witnesses report. It all clicked into place. What I'd experienced wasn't a bear, or even multiple bears. It was something else entirely. I started researching obsessively, not just the typical Bigfoot lore, but historical accounts of wild men in the Appalachians, the Cherokee legends of the Nunyanui, all of it. I found myself driving back to St. Clair County one weekend, sitting in our old kitchen with my dad, asking questions about great-grandma Mabel. She always did say there were people in them woods that weren't really people, Dad said, sipping his coffee. Your grandpa thought she was touched in the head, but folks respected her. When babies wouldn't nurse or someone had the fever no doctor could break, they'd come to Mabel. Did she ever talk about woolly boogers? I asked, the childish term feeling strange in my adult mouth. Dad chuckled. That's just what mountain folks called anything they couldn't explain. But Mabel, she treated them like neighbors, said they'd been on this land long before our family came, and we were the visitors, not them. I drove out to the old stump that afternoon. The path was overgrown, but my feet remembered the way. The creek was lower than I remembered, probably due to the new development up the mountain. The stump was still there, more rotted now. I ran my hand along its edge, remembering Great-Grandma's gnarled fingers doing the same. On an impulse, I took the apple and sandwich I'd brought for lunch and placed them in the hollow center. I sat by the creek for hours, not really expecting anything, but feeling a strange sense of completion. As the sun began to set, I stood to leave. That's when I noticed the scratches on a nearby tree. 3 parallel marks, too high and too deep for a bear, too deliberate for random damage. Below them, freshly carved, was a spiral pattern identical to one Great-Grandma used to draw on her remedy jars. I didn't feel afraid this time. Instead, I felt a certainty that I'd been allowed to see something few people ever witness. The creatures in these woods, the clan of Sasquatch that had apparently coexisted with my family for generations, had protected me that day. The juvenile had gotten too curious, too close, and the elder had intervened. Great-Grandma hadn't been feeding random forest animals. She'd been maintaining a relationship, an ancient pact. The food wasn't just sustenance, it was acknowledgement, respect. I returned to my research position in Montana, but I came back to St. Clair County more often after that. When my parents decided to sell the property, too much upkeep for them as they aged, I surprised everyone by buying it myself. I renovated the farmhouse, turning the back section into a small research station. Officially, I studied the effect of climate change on Appalachian ecosystems. Unofficially, I maintain the family tradition. Every week, I take food to the stump. Sometimes fruits, sometimes leftovers, always enough for more than one. I never stay to watch what takes it. That's not how this works. This is about respect, about boundaries. 3 times now, I've heard that voice in my head again. Not warnings this time, but simple acknowledgements. We are still here. I've never seen them clearly, never tried to photograph or trap them. I know what would happen if I proved their existence. The circus of media, the hunters, the destruction of their habitat. That's not why Great-Grandma taught me about them. Last spring, after a particularly brutal storm, I found 3 trees fallen across my driveway. No way could I move them alone, and the county road crews were overwhelmed with emergency calls. I stood there, calculating how long I'd be stranded, when I noticed the spiral mark carved into one of the fallen trunks. The next morning, the trees were dragged clear of the drive, leaving deep furrows in the mud that no human could have made alone. I left a whole smoked ham at the stump that night. Sometimes, on still evenings when the frogs and crickets create a wall of sound, I sit on my porch and feel eyes watching from the tree line. Not threatening, assessing, curious, intelligent. I raise my coffee mug in a silent toast to them. My neighbors think I'm odd. This woman with a PhD who came back to live alone in her family's old house. The local kids have started calling me Creek Witch when they think I can't hear them. I don't mind. Great-grandma would have laughed at that. I've started keeping records, careful coded notes about patterns of movement, feeding habits, vocalizations heard from the deep woods. Nothing that would lead anyone else to them, but information that might help understand these creatures that have managed to remain hidden in plain sight for centuries. Sometimes I wonder if each hollow, each mountain cove across Appalachia has its own clan, if other families have maintained similar relationships without ever speaking of them publicly. How many crazy old mountain women were actually keepers of this secret? I've never married, never had children. Sometimes that feels like a choice the woods made for me, rather than one I made for myself. Who could I bring into this life who would understand, who would believe? But I'm not alone, not really. On still nights when the moon is new, I sometimes hear them calling to each other across the hollow, not the whoops or screams you hear about on TV shows, but something more complex, almost musical in its cadence. And sometimes, when I'm working in my garden or walking the property line, I'll find things, an unusual stone placed on a fence post, a perfect bird feather propped against my door, once even a cluster of wild blackberries arranged carefully on the stump, as if in reciprocation for my offerings. I've made my peace with the shadows in the hollow. They are not monsters, not miracles, just another species trying to survive in a world that leaves less and less room for secrets. Great-grandma understood that. Now I do too. The creatures that saved me that summer day have given me a purpose I never expected, to be their witness, their silent advocate, the keeper of a boundary between their world and mine. Sometimes protection means not revealing what you know. Sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones you keep to yourself. So I watch and wait and leave my offerings at the old stump. And on dark nights when the wind moves through the trees like whispers, I listen for messages not meant for human ears, but that I can somehow understand anyway. The woolly boogers are still here, and as long as I am too, they'll have at least one human who remembers how to be a good neighbor. Story 11. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the relentless snow. Each swipe cleared only a momentary glimpse of the road ahead before fresh powder reclaimed it. My brother-in-law Derek gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. "How much further to Haynes?" he asked, not taking his eyes off the road. I checked the map spread across my lap, tracing our route with my finger. "Still about 80 miles. We're somewhere near Summit Mountain." It was October 30th, 2004. We'd left Anchorage that morning, hoping to make it all the way through the Yukon to Haines, Alaska before nightfall. The weather forecast had mentioned a possibility of snow, but nothing like this apocalyptic whiteout that had descended upon us around sundown. The car lurched suddenly. Derek fought with the wheel as we skidded toward the edge of the road. "Shit!" he yelled as we slid into a snowbank with a muffled thump. I looked at the dashboard clock, 11:48 p.m. We sat in silence for a moment, the engine idling, heater blasting against the cold that pressed in from all sides. "Let's dig it out," I said finally. "We can't stay here all night." We pulled on our heavy coats, gloves, and boots. The temperature gauge on the car read -15 degrees. When I opened the door, the wind nearly ripped it from my hand. Snow pelted my face like tiny needles. For the next 2 hours, we took turns digging with the small emergency shovel from the trunk, clearing snow from around the tires and trying to rock the car free. Each time we thought we'd made progress, the car would move a few feet before sliding back into the ditch or into another snowbank. By 2 a.m., my hands had lost all feeling despite my gloves. Derek and I were both drenched in sweat beneath our winter layers, the cold air freezing it against our skin whenever we paused to rest. The wind howled through the mountain pass, sometimes so loud it sounded like a freight train. I was on my knees, digging out the back tire again, when Derek suddenly went still. He slowly straightened up, shovel in hand, staring past me up the slope. "Marcus," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Don't make any sudden moves. Look up there." I turned slowly, following his gaze. About 50 yards away, on a bluff 20 feet above us, stood a figure. In the darkness, I could make out only a silhouette, humanoid, standing upright on 2 legs. It was tall, maybe 6 feet, completely black against the snow. It wasn't moving, just watching. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. "I don't know," Derek replied, "but it's been standing there for at least a minute." The figure remained motionless. No steam from breath in the cold air, no movement at all, just a dark shape watching us from the bluff. Derek suddenly lunged toward the car, yanked open the door, and reached under the seat. When he straightened, he was holding his machete, the one he always packed for camping trips. "Derek, what are you doing?" I hissed. He ignored me, raising the machete above his head and starting to wave it. "Hey!" he shouted at the figure. "Hey! Get out of here!" The wind carried his voice across the snowfield. The dark figure didn't react for several seconds. Then, with deliberate slowness, it turned away from us and began walking along the ridge of the bluff. Its movement was smooth and unhurried. It disappeared over the summit within moments. "Jesus Christ," I breathed. What was that? Derek lowered the machete, looking shaken despite his bravado. Probably just some hiker. Had to be, right? Neither of us believed it. No hiker would be out in this blizzard at 2 a.m., standing motionless in the snow. "Let's get back to digging," I said. "I want to get the hell out of here." We returned to our task with renewed urgency, glancing frequently toward the bluff where the figure had stood. The wind had picked up, driving the snow horizontally now. My ears strained for any sound beyond the howling gale. About 10 minutes later, Derek froze again. This time, I saw it immediately too. In the exact same spot on the bluff stood another figure. But this one was different, much different. "Marcus!" Derek's voice cracked. "That's not the same one." He was right. This figure was massive, at least 9 feet tall, with shoulders that looked to be 3 feet wide. Even from 50 yards away in the dark, its sheer size was unmistakable. Dark hair covered its body, visible even at this distance as it blew in the wind. Then it started moving, not walking away like the first figure, but bobbing up and down where it stood. The motion reminded me of a linebacker preparing to charge, rocking on the balls of its feet, building energy. Derek raised his machete again, but I grabbed his arm. "Get in the car," I said, my mouth dry with fear. "Now." "I can scare it off," Derek insisted, pulling against my grip. "That thing could tear you in half," I said. "Get in the damn car." The creature continued its menacing bobbing. I felt like prey being sized up by a predator. With every fiber of my being, I knew we were in danger. I dragged Derek toward the car, not taking my eyes off the massive figure. We scrambled inside, slammed the doors, and hit the locks. The windshield was covered with fresh snow, except for a small, cleared patch. Through it, I could still see the dark shape on the bluff, still bobbing. "What the hell is that thing?" Derek breathed, fogging the window. I didn't answer. My mind raced through possibilities. Bear standing on hind legs, moose with weird antlers, some guy in a costume. But none of them fit what I was seeing. "If it wants to, it could rip the roof right off this car," I said. We sat in terrified silence, engine running, heater blasting. The creature remained on the bluff, occasionally moving side to side but never leaving. Minutes stretched into a half hour, then longer. "We need to get out of here," Derek said finally. "We can't just sit until we run out of gas. And do what? That thing is still up there." "Maybe it's gone. I can't see it anymore." I strained to look through the snow-covered windows. The bluff appeared empty, but with the continuing snowfall and darkness, it was hard to be certain. "We wait a little longer," I decided. We sat for another 30 minutes, scanning the surroundings. No sign of the creature. My watch showed 3:45 a.m. "I'm going out," I said finally. "We need to dig the car out or we'll freeze when the gas runs out." "I'll come with you," Derek said, grabbing the machete again. We exited cautiously, standing back to back as we surveyed the area. The snow continued to fall, but the wind had died down somewhat. The bluff where the creatures had stood was barely visible now. We dug frantically, working without breaks. Every few seconds I'd stop and scan the surrounding darkness. The silence was almost worse than the howling wind had been. Now I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, and every crack of a snow-laden branch made me jump. After 20 minutes of digging, we'd cleared most of the snow from around the tires. I was about to suggest we try moving the car when a distant light caught my attention. "Derek," I said, pointing down the road, "headlights." Sure enough, a pair of lights was moving slowly toward us through the snow. As they approached, I made out a red pickup truck, chains on its tires, creeping carefully along the road. I waved my arms frantically. The truck slowed and came to a stop near our car. The driver's window rolled down, revealing an elderly woman with silver hair and a weathered face. "You boys stuck?" she called out. "Yes, Mom," I replied, relief washing over me. "Slid off about 3 hours ago." "Nasty night to be out," she commented, eyeing our car. "I don't have a tow chain, but there's a snowplow about 10 minutes behind me. Contractor from the American side. He'll get you out." "Thank you," Derek said. "Have you seen anything strange tonight? On the road?" The woman gave us an odd look. "Strange how?" I shot Derek a warning glance. "Just wondering if there are any other vehicles stuck out here," I covered. "Not that I passed," she said. "You two be careful now. That plow will be along shortly." She rolled up her window and continued down the road, her taillights soon swallowed by the swirling snow. "Why'd you ask her that?" I demanded once she was gone. "I wanted to know if she'd seen them too," Derek replied defensively. "And what if she had? What would that change?" Derek didn't answer. We returned to the car to wait for the snowplow, both of us watching the bluff where the creatures had appeared. True to the woman's word, about 15 minutes later, the rumble of a large diesel engine announced the arrival of a snowplow. It pulled up beside us, and a burly man in an orange safety vest climbed down. "Got yourselves in a pickle, huh?" he called cheerfully. "Yeah," I said. "Slid off a few hours ago." "No problem. Got my chain right here. Have you out in 5 minutes." The man worked efficiently, attaching a tow chain to our front axle and using the snowplow to pull us back onto the road. While he worked, I kept glancing nervously at the bluff, but there was no sign of either creature. "You heading to Haynes?" the man asked as he unhooked the chain. "Yes, sir," Derek replied. "Follow me then. I'm clearing all the way there. Just stay back about 50 feet from the plow and you'll be fine." We thanked him profusely and got back in our car. With the plow leading the way, clearing a path through the accumulated snow, we made slow but steady progress. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a massive dark shape following us down the road. We reached Haynes around 7 a.m. The snowplow driver waved as he turned off toward the maintenance yard, and we continued into town. Both of us were exhausted, hungry, and still shaken by what we'd seen. We found a small cafe open for breakfast and stumbled inside. The warmth hit me like a wall after the hours of cold. We slid into a booth, ordered coffee and the biggest breakfast they offered, and finally allowed ourselves to relax slightly. We should tell someone, Derek said quietly. Tell them what? That we saw a Sasquatch? They'll think we're crazy or drunk. I know what I saw, Marcus. I know what I saw too, I replied. But that doesn't mean anyone will believe us. Two men in flannel shirts and work boots sat at the counter near us, talking over their coffee. I wasn't paying attention to their conversation until I heard one of them mention the highway. Third report this month, the older man was saying. Jim Carson said he saw one up near the pass last week. Those Sasquatches don't usually come down so low, the other man replied. Must be the early winter pushing them off the high ground. Derek and I locked eyes across the table. I leaned slightly toward the men, straining to hear more. Where'd you say they spotted them? The younger man asked. On top, right along the highway near Summit Mountain. Frank said there's a whole family of them up there, has been for years. Our food arrived, but I barely noticed. Derek's face had gone pale. You heard that? He whispered. I nodded slowly. We weren't the only ones. A whole family, Derek muttered. That smaller one and the big one. We ate in silence, processing what we'd overheard. When we finished, we paid quickly and headed back to the car. Neither of us suggested stopping at the local police or ranger station. What would we say? That we'd had a standoff with Sasquatches in the middle of a blizzard. As we drove out of Haines toward Juneau, our next destination, the sun finally broke through the clouds, illuminating the snow-covered landscape. Everything looked pristine and peaceful in the morning light. No one would believe us, I said finally, breaking the long silence. No, Derek agreed. But we know what we saw. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, watching the snowy peaks in the distance. Somewhere up there, those creatures were watching travelers pass by. Maybe that had been happening for decades, for centuries even. The thought made me press the accelerator a little harder. Let's stick to the main highways from now on, I said. Derek nodded. And no more night driving through the mountains. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time at the road behind us. For a moment I thought I saw a dark figure standing at the tree line, but when I blinked, it was gone. Just my imagination. I hoped. Story 12. I'll never forget July 3rd, 1998. Some dates burn themselves into your memory, marking the line between before and after. This was one of those days. My name's Rebecca Clark. I was 32 then, living in a small town near Upton, Maine, with my two boys, Jake, 10, and Mikey, 5, and dating Thomas Wilkins, a good man who'd come into our lives about 8 months earlier. Thomas worked for the forestry department and knew every back road and trail in Oxford County. That weekend, with the 4th of July holiday stretching before us, he suggested we take a drive up toward Parmacini Lake. The boys'll love it, he'd said over breakfast that morning. Wild country up there, might even see some moose. I packed sandwiches, juice boxes, and some snacks while Thomas loaded fishing gear into his blue Ford F-150. The boys bounced around the yard in excitement. We didn't get out much. Single mom, 2 jobs, tight budget, so this trip felt special. We left around 1 in the afternoon. The summer air blew warm through the truck's open windows as we headed north on Route 16 toward Wilson Mills. Thomas turned onto a dirt logging road that cut through dense forest. The boys pressed their faces to the windows, Jake pointing out interesting rocks and trees to his little brother. How much farther? Mikey asked for the 3rd time, kicking his legs against the seat. Not too much, Thomas answered, glancing at me with a smile. This road gets a bit rough, but it opens up to some real pretty views of the lake. The truck jostled over ruts and embedded stones. Pine trees crowded close on both sides, their branches occasionally scraping against the sides of the vehicle. The forest here was thick, old growth that had escaped the saws and dozers. Shafts of sunlight penetrated the canopy in places, creating spotlight effects on the forest floor. You need a permit to come up here usually, Thomas explained, but I've got access through work. We climbed a gradual hill, the engine straining slightly. I remember checking my watch, 2:47 p.m. The boys had settled into a game of I Spy, and I leaned back, enjoying the rare moment of peace. As we crested the small hill and started down the other side, Thomas suddenly eased off the gas. The truck slowed dramatically. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, leaning forward over the steering wheel. I followed his gaze down the slight incline ahead of us. Standing in the middle of the dirt road, about 50 yards away, was something I couldn't immediately process. My brain tried to categorize it. Bear? No. Person in a costume? No. The figure stood upright on two legs. It was massive, towering really, at least 7 feet tall. Its entire body was covered in long, shaggy hair, dark brown with reddish tinges where the sun hit it. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Impossibly broad shoulders, arms that hung too low, legs thick as tree trunks. "Mom?" Jake's voice came from behind me, curious rather than frightened. "What's that big hairy guy doing?" The creature moved, not in a startled way, not running or even acknowledging our approaching vehicle. It simply continued whatever journey it had been making across the road. Its gait was smooth, purposeful, almost dignified. 3 massive strides carried it from the right side of the road to the left, a distance that would have taken me at least 6 or 7 steps to cross. Thomas had slowed the truck almost to a crawl now. We were maybe 30 yards away when the creature disappeared into the tree line. "Holy shit," Thomas whispered. He turned to me, eyes wide. "Did you see that? What was that?" My mouth felt dry. "Sasquatch," I said immediately, surprised by my own certainty. The word just came out. "Like Bigfoot?" Jake asked, excitement rising in his voice. Mikey was standing on the seat now, trying to see. "I didn't see it. Where'd it go?" Thomas pulled the truck to a complete stop exactly where the creature had crossed. He put it in park and reached for his door handle. "Don't," I said, grabbing his arm. My heart pounded in my chest. "The boys." He looked at me, then back at the dense wall of trees where the thing had vanished. After a moment he nodded. "Yeah, you're right." "Can we get out and look?" Jake asked. "No, buddy," I said firmly. "We don't know what that was." Thomas put the truck back in drive, but didn't move immediately. "We could come back tomorrow," he suggested. "Look for tracks." I nodded, though a part of me already knew we wouldn't find anything. The creature, whatever it was, hadn't seemed lost or confused. It moved with purpose, like it knew exactly where it was going and what it was doing. "Did we just see Bigfoot?" Jake asked as Thomas slowly accelerated. "I don't know what we saw," I answered honestly. "I missed it," Mikey complained, slumping back in his seat. We continued down the road toward the lake, but the mood had shifted. Thomas kept checking his mirrors. I scanned the forest on both sides of the road. The boys peppered us with questions we couldn't answer. We stayed at the lake for about an hour. Thomas helped the boys fish from the shore while I sat on a flat rock, replaying the sighting in my head. The creature's face, I hadn't seen it clearly. It hadn't turned toward us, but I remembered broad shoulders, a massive back, arms that swung with efficiency. The drive home was quieter. Dark clouds had gathered, and by the time we reached my small house on the outskirts of Upton, raindrops were splattering the windshield. "Still want to go back tomorrow?" Thomas asked as we unloaded the fishing gear. Thunder rumbled in the distance. "If it's not pouring," I said. That night, after the boys were in bed, the rain came down in sheets. I sat by the window watching water stream down the glass, listening to the occasional crack of thunder. I couldn't shake the image of that creature crossing the road, 3 strides and gone. The rain continued through the night and into the next morning. Thomas called around 9. "Road'll be washed out," he said. "No chance of finding tracks now." I knew he was right. The dirt roads up there turned to mud slicks after heavy rain. Besides, we had plans with the boys for 4th of July festivities in town. The moment to investigate had passed. Over the next few weeks, I found myself thinking about the encounter at odd moments. While folding laundry, driving to work, lying awake at night, the image of the creature was burned into my memory. The fluid movement, the stoic indifference to our presence. I mentioned it to only one person at first, Dan Harrigan, a forester who worked with Thomas and had access to the gated roads around Parmacini. "Ever hear any strange stories about the woods up by Wilson Mills?" I asked casually during a cookout in late July. Dan took a swig of his beer. "Strange how?" I hesitated. "Anyone ever report seeing something unusual? Something big?" He studied me for a moment. "You mean like the old stories? The Wendigo tales the Abenaki used to tell?" "No, something more. Physical. Actually seen, not just stories." Dan scratched his beard. "Well, Jed Thompson claimed he saw something up there back in '86. Said it was tall, covered in hair. Nobody believed him. Jed liked his whiskey too much." He paused. "Why? You see something?" I told him briefly about our experience. He listened without interrupting, his expression giving nothing away. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "Those woods are deep, Rebecca. Thousands of acres barely touched by people. Who knows what's living out there?" "You think I imagined it?" "I didn't say that." He finished his beer. "I think people see things they can't explain sometimes. Doesn't make them crazy or liars." That was as close to validation as I got from anyone. Thomas and I talked about it occasionally, comparing our recollections. The boys, especially Jake, wanted to go back and hunt for Bigfoot, but I always found reasons to delay. The truth was, I didn't want to return to that spot. Not because I was afraid of seeing the creature again, but because I was afraid of not seeing it, of having the experience diminished somehow by the ordinary daylight of subsequent visits. Fall came, then winter. Thomas and I continued dating. The boys grew. Life went on. But something had shifted in me since that July afternoon. I found myself looking differently at the forests that surrounded our town. I'd stare into the trees while driving the back roads, wondering what else moved through those woods unseen. The following spring, I read about a similar sighting near Aquasok, about 30 miles west of where we'd been. A hunter claimed to have seen a large, hair-covered bipedal creature crossing a stream at dawn. The local paper ran it as a small filler piece, treating it as something between a curiosity and a joke. I cut out the article and kept it. By the summer of 1999, I'd collected several similar reports from around Maine and New Hampshire. Nothing definitive, just brief encounters, fleeting glimpses, always in remote areas. I didn't become obsessed, didn't join any Bigfoot hunter groups or online forums. This was personal, a private investigation born of something I knew I'd seen but couldn't fully explain. Thomas and I married in 2001. We bought a larger house closer to Rumford, where he'd gotten a promotion. The boys adjusted well to their new schools and to having Thomas as a stepdad. Life was good, normal, stable. But I never forgot. In 2010, Jake, by then a college student studying wildlife biology, asked me about that day. We were sitting on the back deck of our house, watching fireflies blink in the gathering dusk. "Do you still think about it, Mom? What we saw that day up by Parmacini?" I nodded. "Sometimes." "What do you think it was? Really?" I considered my answer carefully. "I think it was something that doesn't fit neatly into what we know about the world. Something that lives alongside us, but separate from us." Jake was quiet for a moment. "I've been doing some research," he said finally. "There are similar reports from all over North America, thousands of them going back centuries." "I know. You believe they're real, don't you? Not just ours, but all of them." "I believe what I saw," I said simply. 3 strides, and it crossed that road. No human moves like that. 2 years ago in 2020, during the pandemic lockdowns, Thomas and I took a drive up to Parmacini Lake. The boys were grown and gone. Jake working for the Fish and Wildlife Service in Oregon, Mikey finishing college in Boston. It was just the two of us, retracing a journey from 22 years earlier. The logging road was still there, though better maintained now. We drove slowly, windows down, listening to the sounds of the forest. When we reached the spot, or what we thought was the spot, Thomas stopped the truck. "Right about here," he said. I nodded, looking at the trees where the creature had disappeared all those years ago. The forest looked different. Trees had fallen, new ones had grown, undergrowth had shifted, but the essence of the place remained unchanged, wild, remote, secret. We got out of the truck this time, something we hadn't done in 1998. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Birds called from the canopy above. A light breeze stirred the leaves. "Do you ever doubt it?" Thomas asked as we stood there. "Ever think maybe we just saw a bear or something and got confused?" I shook my head. "Never. Not for a second." He smiled. "Me neither." We walked to the edge of the trees and peered into the dim forest interior. Shafts of sunlight penetrated here and there, illuminating patches of ferns and moss. The forest stretched away, trackless and vast. Somewhere in there, perhaps miles away by now, or perhaps closer than we'd care to know, something moved through the wilderness of Maine. Something that had crossed our path once, briefly, without concern or acknowledgement. Something that had its own purpose, its own journey, entirely separate from the human world that increasingly claimed every corner of the planet. I didn't need proof beyond what I'd seen with my own eyes. I didn't need validation or scientific confirmation. The knowledge was enough, the certainty that the world was bigger, stranger, and more mysterious than most people ever realized. 3 strides. That's all it had taken for the creature to cross the road and vanish into legend. 3 strides that had crossed my life as well, leaving an impression that 24 years couldn't erase. We stood there for a few more minutes listening to the forest. Then we got back in the truck and continued down the road toward Parmacini Lake, leaving the crossing point behind, but carrying its mystery with us still. Story 13. The red glow of my dash clock read 11:48 p.m. when I first heard it. A deep, throaty grunt from somewhere beyond the tree line. Not quite right for a bear. Too deliberate, too sustained. I'd been a security guard long enough to know the difference between random animal noises and something that demanded attention. This demanded attention. My name's Mike O'Connor. 3 weeks ago, I took this job guarding expensive logging equipment near Lac La Biche in northern Alberta. Easy money, they said. Just park your truck, stay awake, make sure no one messes with the machinery after some local vandalism. Simple. December in northern Alberta means 18 hours of darkness and temperatures that freeze the snot in your nose. I'd been parked at the edge of the clearing for 5 hours already, watching my breath fog up the windows of my pickup while sipping lukewarm tea from a thermos. The heater ran just enough to keep me from freezing, but not enough to drain the battery. The radio crackled occasionally with chatter from the nearest town, some 20 miles away. Otherwise, there was nothing but me, the equipment, and the vast darkness of the Canadian wilderness in winter. When I heard that first grunt, I muted the radio and sat up straighter, scanning the tree line. The high beams from my truck illuminated the massive skidder, a $250,000 piece of equipment that looked like a mutant tractor on steroids, painted bright yellow with massive chain-wrapped tires. Beyond that, nothing but pines and darkness. I heard it again, deeper this time, followed by what sounded like a response from a different direction. 2 of them, whatever they were. Probably just wolves, I muttered to myself, but wolves don't grunt like that. I checked my phone. No signal. Company protocol said to use the satellite phone for emergencies only. This wasn't an emergency yet. The sounds continued, growing closer. Not just grunts now, but heavy footfalls crushing the snow. The distinctive crack of breaking branches. Then something new. A deliberate knocking sound, like wood striking wood. Knock, knock, knock. Pause. Then another series from a different direction. I've hunted every season since I was 12. I know every animal in these woods. Nothing makes that sound. At 12:06 a.m., I decided to investigate. I grabbed my maglite from the glove compartment, made sure my shotgun was loaded with slugs, and stepped out into the cold. The temperature had dropped to around 20 degrees Celsius, and the air bit at my exposed face. The clearing we'd parked the equipment in was roughly circular, maybe 200 feet across, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. The moonlight reflected off the snow, creating an eerie blue-white glow across the landscape. I swept my flashlight across the tree line and froze. Eyes. Multiple pairs of eyes reflecting back at me, glowing like hot coals in the darkness, not at the height of a wolf or bear, but 8, maybe 9 feet off the ground. The closest pair blinked slowly, deliberately. My radio squawked loudly, making me jump. I fumbled with it, turning it off, but when I looked back up, the eyes had shifted position. They were moving along the edge of the clearing, circling. I counted at least 4 pairs. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound authoritative despite the fear creeping up my spine. "This is private property!" The response came immediately, a scream that turned my blood to ice. It started low, almost like a man's shout, then rose in pitch until it was something else entirely, neither human nor any animal I'd ever heard. It lasted maybe 10 seconds before cutting off abruptly. I stumbled back toward my truck, keeping my light trained on the trees. The eyes had stopped moving. They were just watching me now, unblinking. Then the trees began to shake. Not from wind, there wasn't any, but as if something large was pushing against them. Pine needles and snow rained down as the trunks swayed violently. Something flew out of the darkness, a rock the size of a softball, and struck the side of the skidder with a loud clang. Another followed, then another, each impact echoing across the clearing. One whistled past my head close enough that I felt the air displacement. They were throwing rocks at me, deliberately. I reached my truck and yanked the door open, but didn't get in. I needed to see, needed to understand what I was dealing with. I pointed my shotgun in the general direction of the nearest pair of eyes and shouted again, "I'm armed! Back off!" The response was immediate. The trees parted and something stepped into the clearing about 50 yards away. In the dim light, I could see only its silhouette. Massive shoulders, arms that seemed too long for its body, hanging down past what should have been its knees. It stood fully upright, at least 9 feet tall. A second figure emerged to my right, then a third and fourth, spaced evenly around the clearing. They were surrounding me. The largest one moved toward the skidder with a gait that was both fluid and unsettling, too smooth for something so large. When it reached the machine, it grabbed the door handle and yanked, rattling the entire cab. The metal groaned under its strength. I fired a warning shot into the air. The crack of the shotgun echoed across the clearing, but the creatures didn't scatter like animals would. They paused, turned toward me in unison, and then continued their approach, more determined than before. I could hear their breathing now, deep, heavy exhalations that fogged in the cold air. The ground seemed to vibrate with each footfall as they closed in from all sides. In a moment of desperate inspiration, I remembered the road flares in my emergency kit. I dropped to one knee, still keeping the shotgun raised with one hand, and fumbled in my jacket pocket for the flare. My fingers, numb with cold and fear, struggled with the cap. The closest creature was now about 30 feet away. In the moonlight, I could make out matted hair covering its entire body, so thick it looked like a shaggy coat. Its face remained in shadow, but I could see steam rising from its mouth with each breath. It reached toward me with an arm that seemed impossibly long. The flare finally ignited with a hiss, casting an intense red glow across the clearing. For the first time, I saw them clearly. The sight will haunt me until the day I die. The creatures were covered head to toe in thick, dark hair, not fur, but hair, matted and tangled with twigs and forest debris. Their faces were a horrifying blend of human and animal features. A prominent brow ridge shadowed deep-set eyes, a flat, wide nose, and a mouth that seemed too large, pulled back in what looked like a permanent snarl. But it was the eyes that terrified me most. Intelligent, aware, calculating. They knew exactly what they were doing. The red light seemed to disturb them. The nearest one raised a massive hand to shield its face, revealing fingers that were too long, too articulated to be animal paws, but too large to be human. It let out another one of those screams, but this time it sounded almost like frustration. I raised the flare higher, waving it in a wide arc. "Back off!" I shouted again, my voice cracking with fear. "Get back!" To my amazement, they began to retreat, keeping their eyes on the flare. They moved back toward the tree line with surprising quickness, their movements more fluid than their bulk should have allowed. Within seconds, they had disappeared into the darkness, though I could still hear them moving through the underbrush, circling. I kept the flare held high and back toward my truck, never taking my eyes off the forest. When I reached the vehicle, I climbed inside and locked the doors, though the thin metal and glass suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate. I started the engine and turned on every light the truck had, high beams, fog lights, interior lights, creating a bubble of illumination around me. Then I grabbed the satellite phone and called my supervisor. "Mac, it's Mike at Site 7, I said when he answered, my voice shaking. "We've got a situation out here." "What kind of situation?" he asked, voice groggy with sleep. I hesitated. How could I explain what I'd just seen? "There's something out here, multiple somethings. They tried to attack me and the equipment." "Vandals? Bears?" "No, something else. They're huge, Mac. 9 feet tall at least. They walk upright. They were coordinating, throwing rocks, trying to get at me." Silence on the other end. Then, "Mike, have you been drinking?" "No." "God damn it, Mac, I'm serious. They're still out there. I can hear them." And I could, moving through the trees just beyond the reach of my headlights, occasionally knocking on tree trunks, answering each other with those deep grunts. All right, Mac said, clearly not believing me. "You want me to send someone out?" I thought about that. Even if he did send someone, it would take at least an hour to reach me. By then, who knows what might happen. "No," I decided. "I'm going to stay in the truck. I've got the shotgun and more flares. They seem to not like the light, but Mac, I'm telling you, these aren't bears or wolves or anything I've ever seen before. Just hang tight, Mike. Dawn's in about 6 hours. If you still feel unsafe, use the gun. Company insurance covers animal attacks." He hung up, and I was alone again. The next 5 hours were the longest of my life. The creatures never left. They maintained their positions just beyond the tree line, occasionally visible when they moved between the trees. I could see their eyes reflecting my headlights, sometimes close to the ground, as if they were crouching, sometimes high up, as if they had climbed the trees. At 3:17 a.m., one of them threw another rock. It struck my windshield, creating a spiderweb of cracks across the passenger side. I fired another warning shot out the window, and they retreated deeper into the forest, but only temporarily. By 4:30 a.m., my truck's battery was starting to weaken from running the lights so long. I had to make a choice: conserve power and risk them approaching again, or potentially find myself stranded when dawn came. I compromised by turning off the interior lights, but keeping the headlights on. At 5:15 a.m., they began to withdraw. First, the knocking sounds became more distant. Then the eyes disappeared, one pair at a time. By 5:45, I couldn't hear or see any sign of them. At 6:30 a.m., the first grey light of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon. I stepped out of my truck, shotgun still clutched in my trembling hands, and surveyed the clearing. The evidence was everywhere: Massive footprints in the snow, some measuring nearly 2 feet in length, with 5 distinct toe impressions. Broken branches 9 feet off the ground, rocks scattered around the equipment that hadn't been there the day before, deep impressions in the snow where they had stood watching me. When my replacement arrived at 7 a.m., a guy named Pete Williamson, who worked the day shift, he found me sitting in my truck, doors locked, staring blankly at the tree line. "Jesus, Mike, you look like shit," he said when I rolled down my window. "Rough night?" I just pointed at the footprints, the broken branches, the cracked windshield. Pete whistled low. "Bears?" I shook my head. "Look at those tracks, Pete. What bear stands on 2 legs long enough to make prints like that all around the clearing? What bear throws rocks with enough accuracy to hit a windshield at 50 yards? He didn't have an answer for that. I worked that site for another month, but they never came back during my shifts. Maybe they'd made their point. Maybe they'd just been curious about the machinery. Or maybe, as I've come to believe, they were sending a message. This is our territory, our forest, and you're the intruder here. I've done research since then. The local indigenous people have stories about tall, hairy men of the forest who protect the wilderness. Other logging operations in northern Alberta have reported equipment vandalized, rocks thrown, trees pushed down across access roads. I don't talk about it much. When I do, people look at me the way you probably are now. But I know what I saw. I know what was out there in those woods. Something ancient, something territorial, something that walks on 2 legs but isn't human. I still work security, but never alone and never in remote locations. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed. Some places still belong to them, not us. And that clearing near Lac La Biche, that's definitely their territory. I just count myself lucky they let me leave it. Story 14. My stomach cramped for the 3rd time in an hour. Empty, always empty now. I pressed my hand against my midsection and felt the bones too close to the surface. My fur, once thick and glossy, hung in matted clumps. 3 months without proper rain had changed everything. I rose from my resting spot beneath the pine trees and sniffed the air. Nothing. No scent of deer or elk, or even the small creatures that normally skittered through the underbrush. The drought had driven them away or killed them outright. The berries had withered on their branches weeks ago, and the streams where I once caught fish had shrunk to muddy trickles. My kind doesn't have a name for ourselves. The humans call us Sasquatch, Bigfoot, or other names spoken in disbelief. We've survived by staying hidden, by being the shadow that moves between trees, the sound mistaken for wind. But hunger makes staying hidden harder. Hunger makes mistakes inevitable. I moved down the mountain slope, my bare feet finding purchase on familiar terrain despite my weakened state. 8 feet tall and covered in dark brown fur, I blended with the shadows of the forest. But I was alone and afraid. The rest of my clan had moved northward weeks ago, seeking better hunting grounds. I'd stayed, stubborn and territorial. Now I wondered if I'd made a fatal mistake. The cabin came into view as the sun began to set. 2-story, wooden, with a porch and windows that glowed yellow in the twilight. I'd watched it for days from the safety of the tree line, noting the comings and goings of its inhabitants. A male and female human, along with 2 smaller ones, children. They had food. I could smell it even from this distance. I crouched in the underbrush, watching and waiting. Night fell completely. The yellow lights in the windows went out one by one. Still, I waited, counting the minutes in my head the way my mother had taught me long ago. Patience, always patience. 3 hours after the last light went out, I moved. My footsteps, despite my size, made almost no sound on the pine needle carpet as I approached the cabin. The night air carried the scent of coming rain. Finally, but it would be too late to save the season's forage. The back of the cabin had a window left partially open. Humans did this sometimes, letting in the cool mountain air while they slept. I peered through the gap, seeing a room with counters and a large silver box, what humans kept their food in. Slowly, carefully, I pushed the window wider, wincing at a small squeak from the hinges. I paused, listening for any change in the rhythmic breathing from the sleeping humans upstairs. Nothing. I continued until the opening was wide enough, then squeezed my massive frame through with a dexterity that belied my size. My feet touched down on the cool linoleum floor. The silver box, refrigerator I'd heard humans call it, hummed softly. I moved toward it, pulled the door open, and squinted against the sudden light that spilled out. Inside was more food than I'd seen in months, meat wrapped in clear covering, fruits, vegetables, containers of mysterious substances. I grabbed what I could, stuffing it into my mouth. Cold chicken disappeared in 2 bites. A container of some white, creamy substance followed. Apples and carrots. My starving body demanded more, faster. I ate without tasting, without pause. When the refrigerator was half empty, I turned to the cabinets, opening them to find boxes and cans. Some I recognized, others mystified me. I took what looked edible and shoved it into a cloth bag I found hanging on a hook. A creak from upstairs froze me in place. Footsteps, someone was awake. I moved quickly to a doorway, pressing myself against the wall as a small human, one of the children, padded down the stairs. A little girl with hair the color of dead grass, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She walked right past the kitchen entrance toward another room. I heard water running, then the flush of a toilet. My heart pounded as she made her way back. She paused at the kitchen entrance, yawning. Would she notice the open refrigerator, the ransacked cabinets? I held my breath. She turned and headed back upstairs, each step creaking slightly under her weight. I should have left then, should have taken my bag of food and disappeared into the night, but hunger makes you reckless. I moved back to the refrigerator for one last handful of food. The child had reached the top of the stairs when she suddenly turned back. Perhaps she'd forgotten something, or perhaps some primal instinct told her something was wrong. She took 2 steps down, then stopped. She saw me. Our eyes met across the kitchen. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. I stood frozen, a package of meat in my massive hand, my entire body visible in the refrigerator's glow. Run, my instinct screamed. Kill her, my hunger whispered. She'll alert the others. I did neither. Instead, I slowly raised my free hand, pressing one finger to my lips in the gesture I'd seen humans use to request silence. Her eyes widened further, but she remained quiet. For 3 heartbeats, we stared at each other. Then I backed toward the window, the bag of food clutched tight. She watched me go, never moving, never screaming. As I slipped back through the window, our eyes met one final time. Then I was gone, racing into the forest with my stolen prize. I ran for nearly an hour, putting distance between myself and the cabin. Finally, I stopped at a familiar cluster of rocks, a landmark leading to my den. I moved the stones in a specific pattern, a signal to any of my kind who might pass this way. It meant food here, safety here. A lie now, but old habits persisted. My den lay beneath a rocky overhang, hidden by thick brush and fallen logs. I crawled inside and emptied my bag of treasures. In the darkness, I couldn't see colors, but my fingers identified shapes, textures. I ate until my stomach hurt, then ate more. When I finally stopped, less than half remained. I wrapped the leftover food in leaves and buried it in the cool earth at the back of my den. I slept then, my first peaceful sleep in weeks. But even in sleep, hunger's shadow loomed. It would return. The food would run out. And then what? 3 days later, I faced that question again. The stolen food was gone. My stomach growled constantly now, a low rumble that seemed to echo through the forest. I needed more. I couldn't return to the cabin, too dangerous. But I knew of another place where humans gathered, where they were careless with their food. The campground lay 2 miles east, in a valley beside a stream that had once been a river. I'd avoided it my entire life, as had all my kind. Too many humans, too much noise and light. But desperate times required desperate measures. I approached as the sun set, keeping to the shadowy perimeter. 20 or 30 small cloth structures, tents, dotted the clearing. Humans moved between them, cooking over small fires, talking, laughing. The smell of roasting meat made my mouth water. I watched for hours as activity gradually slowed. Fires were extinguished, voices quieted, humans retreated to their tents. By midnight, only a few remained awake, speaking in hushed tones around the dying embers of their fires. I circled the campground, looking for an opening of vulnerability. On the far side, several large containers, coolers, sat outside a cluster of tents. I could smell the food inside them. I'd have to cross 15 yards of open ground to reach them, but the area was dark, the nearest humans apparently asleep. I crept forward, staying low despite my height. The ground was dry, every twig and leaf a potential betrayal. I reached the first cooler and carefully lifted its lid. Inside, wrapped sandwiches, fruit and cans of something. I took all of it, stuffing food into my mouth while filling the crook of my arm with more. Emboldened by success, I moved to a second cooler, then a third. Some instinct warned me to retreat, to take what I had and disappear back into the forest. But hunger pushed me forward toward a fourth cooler that sat directly beside a tent. As I reached for it, a sudden light blinded me. A beam cut through the darkness, illuminating my massive form. "What the hell?" a male voice, shocked and terrified. I straightened to my full height, towering over the human who stood 10 feet away, a flashlight in one hand and a metal object in the other. A gun. I recognized it from observing hunters. "Jesus Christ!" the man gasped, stumbling backward. The flashlight dropped from his hand, its beam now pointing uselessly at the sky. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, food items tumbling from my grasp as I crashed through the underbrush. Behind me, I heard shouting, more lights flicking on, the chaos of humans discovering something impossible in their midst. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. Even with my superior knowledge of the terrain, I knew they could track me if they tried hard enough. Humans were persistent. Humans had weapons and technology and numbers. If they decided I was a threat, they would hunt me down. By dawn, I'd reached higher elevation, terrain so rocky and steep that tracking would be nearly impossible. I found a small cave and crawled inside, my body trembling from exertion and fear. The few food items I'd managed to keep were quickly consumed, barely taking the edge off my hunger. I spent 2 days hiding in that cave, venturing out only at night to drink from a small spring nearby. My fear of human retaliation gradually subsided as no search parties appeared. But my hunger remained, a constant, gnawing presence. On the third day, I smelled something that made my heart race. Deer, fresh nearby. I emerged from the cave, my nostrils flaring. There, on a rocky ledge 20 yards above, a young buck, thin but alive, grazing on the sparse vegetation that grew between rocks. I began to stalk it, moving with a silence born from a lifetime of hunting. The deer sensed something. Its head came up, ears twitching, but I remained motionless, just another shadow among the rocks. After a moment it returned to grazing. Closer, 5 yards now, the deer's flank rose and fell with each breath. I could smell its warmth, its life. My muscles tensed, preparing. I launched myself forward in a burst of speed, covering the remaining distance in 2 bounds. The deer tried to leap away, but my hand caught its hind leg. We tumbled together on the rocky ground, the deer kicking and struggling. My other hand found its throat and squeezed. The struggle continued for 30 seconds, then grew weaker. Finally, the deer went still. I wasted no time. My teeth tore through hide and flesh, finding the warm meat beneath. I ate ravenously, blood running down my chin and chest. This was proper food, the kind my body was designed for. Not the strange, processed human food, but fresh, raw meat that filled me with strength. When I finished, little remained but bones and hide. I felt truly satisfied for the first time in months. The successful hunt had awakened something in me beyond mere fullness, a reminder of what I was, of where I belonged. That night, I left the high rocks and traveled further into the mountains, away from the campground, away from the cabin, away from all human presence. The forest grew denser here, untouched by human trails or structures. The air smelled different, cleaner, wilder. 3 days of travel brought me to a valley I'd never seen before. A river ran through it, fed by mountain springs unaffected by the drought. I found tracks, deer, elk, even moose. Game was plentiful here, and best of all, no sign of humans. I made a new den beneath a rocky overhang facing east, where morning sun would warm me. I marked the territory as mine with broken branches placed in patterns only my kind would recognize, with stones stacked in specific formations. This place would be home now. That night, rain finally came. I sat at the entrance of my den, watching water pour from the sky, soaking the parched earth. The drought would end, the forest would recover, and I would survive as my kind always had, in the shadows, in the spaces between human knowledge and wilderness. In the morning, I hunted again and caught a rabbit, small but enough. I ate it overlooking my new valley, feeling the strength returning to my body day by day. The humans, back at the cabin and campground, would tell stories now. The girl would speak of the monster in her kitchen who asked for silence. The man would describe a creature impossible in size, standing by their coolers. They would be believed by some, ridiculed by others. Search parties might form, then disband as they found nothing. And I would remain here, in this hidden valley where humans rarely ventured. I would hunt and eat and grow strong again. When winter came, I would sleep in my den, safe and full. Perhaps in spring, I would seek out others of my kind, rejoin my clan. For now, though, I was content to simply exist as what I truly was. Not a monster from human nightmares, but a creature of legend, a part of the ancient magic of the woods. I curled up in my den as afternoon rain began to fall again, the sound a lullaby that carried me into dreamless sleep. Story 15. I'd been looking forward to this fishing trip for months. School was almost over, and after graduation, I'd have to face real life. But for now, I had 3 days at Jimmy's family cabin outside Steamboat Springs. Nothing but me, my buddy, and the best trout fishing in Colorado. The morning air bit at my face as I stepped out of the cabin. Jimmy was still passed out from our late-night beers. 6:30 in the morning, mist hanging over the river, and the mountains standing guard against the brightening sky. I grabbed my fishing rod, tackle box, and the small .22 shotgun I'd brought along. Bears were common in these parts, and I wasn't taking chances. The path to the river was slick with morning dew. My boots left dark impressions in the grass as I made my way down to the spot Jimmy had described. A bend in the river, where the current slowed and the trout gathered in the deeper pools. Perfect. I waded in carefully, the cold water seeping through my waders and making me catch my breath. The first cast sailed through the air, the line unfurling like a question mark before settling on the surface. The river tugged at my legs as I found my footing on the slippery rocks. An hour passed. I'd caught 2 decent-sized rainbow trout, keeping them on a stringer in the water beside me. The morning sun had burned away most of the mist, warming my shoulders through my flannel shirt. I cast again, watching the lure dance across the surface before disappearing beneath. That's when I heard the first splash, small, like a pebble dropping into water, about 15 feet upstream from where I stood. I glanced up, figuring a fish had jumped, or maybe a squirrel had knocked something loose from a branch. Another splash, then another, deliberate, rhythmic. I reeled in my line, squinting against the sun's reflection on the water. 3 more pebbles plopped into the river, creating perfect concentric rings that drifted toward me. "Hello?" I called, thinking maybe Jimmy had woken up and was messing with me. No answer. That's when I noticed the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but a complete absence of sound. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing but the gentle gurgle of water against rocks and the soft whisper of breeze. The forest had gone dead quiet. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the river water. Growing up hunting in Missouri, I'd spent enough time in the woods to know when something wasn't right. Animals don't just stop making noise for no reason. My hand moved to the .22 strapped across my back. Not much protection against a full-grown bear, but better than nothing. I scanned the riverbank, looking for signs of movement. The rocky slope on the opposite side rose steeply, dotted with pine trees and boulders, perfect cover for predators. Another pebble splashed, closer this time. That's when I saw it, movement among the trees about 50 yards up the slope. A flash of reddish-brown hair, too tall for a deer, too red for a black bear. I squinted, trying to make out shapes in the dappled shadows. 2 bears, maybe, standing together on their hind legs. The shape shifted, and I realized with a jolt that it wasn't 2 bears. It was one thing, one very large thing. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I began backing up, keeping my eyes fixed on the spot where I'd seen movement. The current pushed against the backs of my legs as I shuffled backward. The thing moved again, stepping partially into a shaft of sunlight. Reddish-brown hair covered its body. It stood upright, the way a man would stand, but bigger, much bigger. 7, maybe 8 feet tall. I couldn't make out details of its face, just a dark shadow where it should be. But I could feel it watching me. Not with aggression, but with curiosity, territorial awareness. Whatever it was studying me the same way I was studying it. My foot slipped on a moss-covered rock and I nearly went down. I caught myself, heart racing, and kept backing up. The creature didn't advance, just shifted its weight from one foot to the other. I could see massive shoulders, a barrel chest, long arms hanging at its sides. "Jimmy!" I called out, hoping my voice would carry back to the cabin. No response. I kept backing up, never turning my back on the thing on the hillside. My legs trembled from the effort of moving against the current while maintaining balance on the slippery riverbed. I stumbled over submerged rocks, branches, my own fear. The thing still didn't move toward me, but it raised one arm slightly, as if in acknowledgement. The gesture was so human it sent a new wave of fear through me. This wasn't some animal acting on instinct. This thing had intelligence behind its eyes. I reached the riverbank and scrambled up, dropping my fishing rod in the process. I let it go, keeping my focus on the creature as I backed up the path to the cabin. It was still watching me, its massive form now fully visible against the tree line. In the clearer light, I could see broad shoulders, a sloped forehead, a massive jaw. My back hit something solid. I nearly screamed before realizing it was a tree. I edged around it, keeping my eyes forward. The cabin was maybe 100 yards behind me now. I could feel sweat trickling down my back despite the cool morning air. The creature raised its arm again, and this time I saw what looked like a hand, not a paw. A hand, open and close. Then it turned and moved back into the trees, disappearing with surprising grace for something so large. I waited, frozen, for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. When I was sure it wasn't coming back, I turned and ran the rest of the way to the cabin. I burst through the door, slamming it behind me and throwing the lock. Jimmy sat up in his sleeping bag, startled awake. "What the hell, man?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "There's something out there," I gasped, still trying to catch my breath. "By the river, it was watching me, throwing rocks." Jimmy squinted at me, then reached for his glasses on the floor beside his sleeping bag. "Something like what?" "I don't know. Big, hairy, walking on 2 legs. I was pacing now, looking out the windows as I moved. "Not a bear. Definitely not a bear." I expected him to laugh, to tell me I was seeing things or that I'd spooked myself. Instead, he nodded slowly and said, "Yeah, they've always been here." I stopped pacing. "What?" Jimmy shrugged, reaching for his jeans. "They've always been here. he repeated calmly, and they've never bothered anyone before. What do you mean, they? You know what that thing is? My grandpa used to see them, my dad too. Jimmy pulled on his shirt. They keep to themselves mostly. Just curious sometimes. I stared at him, dumbfounded. And you didn't think to mention this before I went fishing alone? Honestly, didn't think you'd see one. They usually stay higher up the mountain. I sank onto the worn couch, my legs suddenly unable to support me. What are they? Jimmy just shrugged again. Local folks have different names. Sasquatch, Bigfoot. My grandpa called them the forest people. Jesus Christ, I muttered, putting my head in my hands. It was real. It was actually real. Did it hurt you? Jimmy asked. No, it just watched, threw some pebbles in the water. Yeah, they do that. Dad says it's how they get your attention without scaring you too bad. Jimmy stood and stretched. Want some coffee? You look like you could use some. I nodded numbly, still processing what had happened. Outside the window, the forest looked normal, peaceful even. Birds had resumed their morning songs. The world had returned to its ordinary rhythm, as if nothing unusual had occurred. But something had changed. I had changed. We stayed 2 more days, but I never went back to the river alone. Jimmy and I fished together, and I kept the .22 within reach the whole time. We didn't see any more signs of the creature, but I felt eyes on me constantly. Every rustle in the bushes, every distant crack of a twig made me flinch. On our last morning, as we packed up to leave, I saw it again, just a glimpse through the kitchen window. A large upright figure at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by trees. It raised its arm once more in that strange, almost human gesture, then melted back into the forest. Jimmy, I said quietly, it's back. He came to the window and looked out, but it was already gone. They're saying goodbye, he said simply. It's a sign of respect. We drove back to town in silence. I wanted to tell someone, to report what I'd seen, but who would believe me? And based on Jimmy's casual reaction, the locals already knew. They'd just chosen to leave the creatures alone, and in return, the creatures left them alone. But I couldn't shake what I'd seen. That wasn't just some animal. It had intelligence in its eyes, purpose in its movements. It existed in a world parallel to ours, watching from the shadows of trees, from the spaces we've forgotten how to see. 35 years have passed since that spring morning in Colorado. I'm 53 now, with a small farm in rural Missouri. I still hunt every season, walking the same familiar woods I've known since childhood, but I never go unarmed anymore, even just to check fence lines or gather firewood. The experience changed me in ways I'm still understanding. I became more watchful, more attuned to the subtle signals of the natural world, the sudden silence of birds, the feeling of being observed, the knowledge that there are things in this world we've never properly catalogued or understood. I've never seen another creature like the one by the river, but sometimes, in the deepest parts of my property where the trees grow thick and the undergrowth tangles, I get that same feeling, the weight of eyes on my back, the unnatural quiet, the sense that I'm not alone. I've never told my wife the full story. She thinks I'm just cautious from years of hunting experience. My kids joke about my insistence on bringing a rifle, even for short walks in the woods. Dad's preparing for the zombie apocalypse, they tease, if they only knew what I was really watching for. Last fall, while tracking a buck through the back 40, I found something that stopped me cold. A perfect stack of stones, too deliberate to be natural, too remote to be the work of trespassers. Beside it, pressed into the soft earth, was a footprint, 18 inches long, 5 toes, unmistakably a foot, but not human. Not entirely. I left my property immediately, abandoning the hunt. For a week I couldn't bring myself to venture past my cleared fields. When I finally told my wife I was thinking of selling the farm, she looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "This land has been in your family for generations," she said. "What's gotten into you?" I couldn't explain it to her. How could I say that I'd faced down a charging boar without flinching? But the thought of encountering one of those creatures here in my own woods fills me with a dread so profound it makes my hands shake. Because if they're here, if they've always been here, like Jimmy said about Colorado, then everything I thought I knew about these woods, about what's real and what isn't, has been a comfortable lie. I still own the farm, still hunt these woods, but now I carry a more powerful rifle. I watch the tree line with new eyes, and I've made a promise to myself. If I ever see one of those creatures on my land, I won't hesitate. I'll quit hunting, sell the farm, move to the city if I have to. Some people spend their whole lives hoping to witness something unexplainable, something that proves the world is bigger and stranger than we've been taught. They don't understand what it costs to carry that knowledge. To know that when you walk in the woods, something ancient and intelligent might be watching you from just beyond the next ridge. Something that was here long before us, and will likely remain long after we're gone. They don't understand that once you've seen it, you can never unsee it, and the world never looks quite the same again.